so now we started the broadcast. And I go here. See. I look at the broadcast. See. Look at the broadcast. See. Honestly, that's straight. That's kind of perfect for real. So let's get on with it, dude.
Then I would say we could almost run like a reverse Bayesian type of maybe not Bayes, but you could run also like a reverse, I guess reverse Pascal, right? You could say, well, sure, maybe it's the case that it's better for, remember, narrow road Christians. Yes, it's the world majority religion, but of world population throughout history, narrow road. Especially when you talk about intrinsically, religious, if you're, the church within the church, Israel within Israel, all that kind of stuff. I'm sure you'd agree, not everyone that says that they are Christian was ever saved, depending on your theological view. Some people are going to say that of me, right? So, sure, you have better quality of life of those people who are in pure and genuine relationship with Jesus. But again, the flip side is now you have billions of people that are now condemned because of it, right? So, whereas you would have all of those people, the billions plus those who are living life with Jesus, all of those people would have had that quality of life in the afterlife, right? Because they wouldn't have been.
It may be there in time. I mean, he says this universe is going on for millions and millions of years. Look at how far we've advanced in just 100 years. We went from not even having planes to putting a man on the moon in what, like 70 years or so? Imagine what we could do in 10,000 years and exploring the universe. And part of my eschatology, even in the post-millennialist sense, is that after the resurrection, it'll be our job to turn multiple planets into Eden. Now, I know that's speculative, but that could very well be the case. And if that's the case, the beginning of the timeline is very small compared to the millions and all the good it could create in the long run. Now, you talked about that God should remain even more hidden because, people would get on the other side and they'd be saved. Again, I think we look to the other side through a mirror darkly. We don't have all the information. I don't think it's this idea that if you die without all the information, you're necessarily saved. Because again, I've only said that if there are non-resistant, non-believers, they could very well have a good excuse. But I also don't think that necessarily gets them in before God. I think every creature has to choose whether they want to follow God or not.
Trying to get back to where I was.
There could still be this idea of these Satan-like figures, people that are in God's presence, and they
that type of thing, right? So if my kids, if you found out that my kids were like
5 seconds, sorry,
yeah.
Apparently if I take my earbuds out, me away with his powerful arguments. That's obviously.
So obviously, it's hidden for our benefit.
Let's talk about. So hidden for our benefit. So let's talk. I just want to talk briefly, and I know you said you're not making this, but I'm going to talk about briefly about the ontological distinctions. From one, God is omniscient. He can see eternity. He can see, for example, our life is a mere blip compared to eternity with him. So he's going to be able to see all of that into perspective. Led to the idea of abusing children being wrong, created such a wonderful world, and so we should be spreading this if it's actually really good for us. Second, I would be given an Aristotelian response that Christianity is eudaimonia. It is
influence on things like slavery, right? So there's that. But when it comes into quality of living, right, there a lot of improvements come around by having institutional educational systems, right? But
so I think there are multiple.
I would push back on both points. I would say one of those is kind of a chicken and egg scenario. I grant that Christianity has brought great things into the world, right? But the question is it the Christianity that's coming that's improving the cultures, or is it Western civilization that's coming that has created a bunch of, there's that question of what actually is going. Now, Christianity has had positive influence on things like slavery, right? So there's that.
So Mike definitely disagrees with Tyler's side.
Right? A lot of improvements come around by having institutional educational systems, by having better science and medical systems, by understanding about how washing hands helps. Right, one of the best things that missionaries did when they traveled the world is they brought hand washing places. There's a lot of the benefit and the improvement of quality of life isn't, the correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation. So that'd be my first on that first point. If you want to come back to that in a minute. The second one. Oh, now I drew a blank. What you're saying?
The best way for us to live,
Yes,
I would say, is
so,
Christian life. Yeah.
So then I would say we could almost run like a reverse Bayesian type of, maybe not Bayes, but you could run also like a reverse, I guess, reverse Pascalian, right? You could say, well, sure, maybe it's the case that it's better for, remember, narrow road Christians. Yes, it's the world's majority religion, but of world population throughout history, narrow road.
What is a narrow road Christian?
Especially when you talk about intrinsically, religious, if you're, the church within the church, Israel within Israel, all that kind of stuff. I'm sure you'd agree. Not everyone that says that they are Christian was ever saved, depending on your theological view. Some people are going to say that of me, right? So, sure, you have better quality of life of those people who are in pure and genuine relationship with Jesus. But again, the flip side is now you have billions of people that are now condemned because of it, right? So, whereas you would have all of those people, the billions plus those who are living life with Jesus, all of those people would have had that quality of life in the afterlife, right? Because they wouldn't have been condemned for rejecting Jesus, right? So it seems to me that yes, you have this finite good of a quality of life on this side of the veil, but you have, again, run a Pascalian, you have an infinite amount for these billions and billions of people on the other side, right? So how is that a better trade-off?
So I want to respond to four things you said: the Western civilization versus Christianity, the narrow road issue, billions now condemned. So I guess three things there. So is it Western civilization or Christianity? I cannot be more direct. It is Christianity, and there are numerous scholars that have pointed out this. Check out Samuel Moying's book, Christian Human Rights. It's a great book with numerous authors called Christianity and Human Rights: An Introduction. You can look at, again, Robert Woodbury actually ran a regression model where he actually demonstrated that Christian missionary activity is leading to all of these good things, which comes directly from the Great Commission. Tom Holland's book, Dominion, has gone into numerous ways. Stephen Martin's wrote a little paper like Do Not Sexually Abuse Children, showed how Christians had to come up with new language to condemn the Roman practices of using children for sex and all these things. A lot of what we got here, I mean, this is also Charles Taylor's point in his book, A Secular Age, that Christianity created secularism in itself. And we see there's just so much evidence that Christianity is the biggest pillar to Western civilization. I'm not saying it's the only pillar, but it definitely is the biggest pillar when it comes to this issue. So it definitely is Christianity that is going to this. And I talked about it in my video on postmillennialism called Rethinking the End Times, where I gave out a lot of evidence, not just from this, but also from how Christianity was crucial for the development of science and then led to a lot of technology, these types of things. The other issue you talked about is the narrow road issue. Like, there's billions of people that are now condemned. Well, this is, again, from a limited perspective. We don't know how long the timeline is supposed to go on in this case, or what is supposed to happen in the future. This may just be the beginning of human civilization, and it could spur Paul Davies, for example, who's a deist, says, he was asked once the question, why is life not across the whole universe? And he said, well, it may be, and it may be there in time. I mean, he says this universe is going to go on for millions and millions of years. Look at how far we've advanced in just 100 years. We went from not even having planes to putting a man on the moon in 70 years or so? Imagine what we could do in 10,000 years and exploring the universe. And part of my eschatology, even in the post-millennialist sense, is that after the resurrection, it'll be our job to turn multiple planets into Eden. Now, I know that's speculative, but that could very well be the case. And if that's the case, the beginning of the timeline is very small compared to the millions and all the good it could create in the long run. Now, you talked about that God should remain even more hidden because, people would get on the other side and they'd be saved. Again, I think we look to the other side through a mirror darkly. We don't have all the information. I don't think it's this idea that if you die without all the information, you're necessarily saved. Because, again, I've only said that if there are non-resistant, non-believers, they could very well have a good excuse. But I
necessarily.
I also don't think that necessarily gets them in before God. I think every creature has to choose whether they want to follow God or not. I think very well there could still be this idea of these Satan-like figures, people that are in God's presence, and they still rebel. There could be somebody, who was born on like Hawaii, 800 years ago, who dies, and he ends up following Satan anyway, or taking that same kind of route. We don't know everything that's going on the other side. But when it comes to our terms of existence on this world, I don't think divine hiddenness is really that much of a problem for Christianity in what we know now and what we have available.
So, well, I could answer to a bunch of those, but I get maybe we can shift gears a little bit.
Okay.
I wonder. I want to go to like the father and the loving father language.
Okay.
It seems to me that if I, as a father,
I wonder what Michael's thinking, because as soon as he brought up like the Christianity or Western civilization, he got so excited, started making notes for every single point he was bringing up, and then went super in depth on all that stuff. And then Tyler's response was, I mean, I could respond to all of that, but let's shift gears. And Michael, he's like, all right, okay. Meanwhile, like inside, he's probably furious because he wants to go, but he's like, he enjoyed that conversation. They're now getting off of. It's pretty funny.
Was as well. Okay. Let's just use the thing like hidden, right? I'm not going to try to make it polemical and say absentee or deadbeat or anything like that. I've seen some of those in the comments. I'm not trying to say, oh, the Christian God is a deadbeat dad or like that. That's not it. It's just, I mean, that's not my rhetoric. So like, if people say that's not my claim. That's, but it seems like it would make us a deadbeat dad if we did that type of thing, right? So if my kids, if you found out that my kids were like,
5 seconds, sorry, apparently if I take my earbuds out, the mic goes off and my ear got itchy. So sorry, can you go back like 5 or 10 seconds?
Oh, yeah. I was just gonna say. So it seems to me that
I spell deadbeat. Is it D-E-A-T?
What would you think about if you found out that my
I think it's E-I-T, right?
my kids, we're like, oh, we don't know our dad. He doesn't show up. We never talk to him. He never answers us. We don't know what he looks like. We've never met him. All that kind of stuff. And you came and talked to me. And you're like, what's up? And I'm like, it's for their good, right? I'm helping them to grow up to be self-sufficient. And if I showed up, lots of kids, when their dads show up, they abuse them and want a Mercedes illegitimately. Like, would you be satisfied with those types of answers? And I'm not trying to say like the God is like a big human or anything like that, but if loving father is is an analog to a concept, then surely loving father is the analog concept. Would you find that to be that you'd hear that and be like, oh, that's a dad who loves his kids, or that's a dad who is present with his kids?
So I do not think a human would be considered loving if they did that. No, but I don't think that necessarily compares to God's ontological status, if that makes sense.
It does. I mean, it does. And I'm not trying to push the creator-creature distinction, right? I understand the distinction. I think it's a valid.
So I do not think a human would be considered loving if they did that. No, but I don't think that necessarily compares to God's ontological status, if that makes sense.
It does. I mean, it does. And I'm not trying to push the creator-creature distinction, right? I understand the distinction. I think it's a valid distinction in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
But the reason why I think this is important is because we're told to love as God loved. Like it's not that. Like when in the Bible, when believers are told to judge, right? It's not that they're told that they're going to be the eschatological judge and they're all that kind of stuff, right? There's an analog that happens. But when we're told that God is love, and the greatest command is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself, we don't think, oh, well, that means the exact opposite of what it means for God to be loved. Right? The analog has to match, right? So they have to match for the analog to work. Right? So if we say, oh, well, that would not only would
The issues that God tells us to love like him. This not match.
that would make someone actually positively unloving. Right? Then I don't know what to do with the analog when unloving can be love. Does that make sense?
Seems like Tyler's saying it should be 1-to-1. The way that God loves should be 1-to-way of how a parent should love his kid. Because there's this big discrepancy with the hiddenness aspect of love that for us is not love, but for God it is. That discrepancy it makes it not match, and that needs to be explained or something. Which I feel like Michael would agree, like that does need to be explained, and everything they talked about here was the explanation. Maybe, unless he's saying like nothing can explain that, like it should just be 1-to-1, and that the fact that there is that discrepancy is the issue.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. This idea of this whole thing. So we're told to love as God loves us. One second, I'm gonna put a light on here because it's getting dark because of the clouds. Sorry, again, for the audience, I could lose power because I'm in Tucson and it's monsoon season, and there is a big cloud out there, just so everyone's aware. So if I just vanish, it's because Tyler has scared me away with his powerful arguments. That's obviously the reason. So
obviously, it's hidden for our benefit.
Let's talk about. So hidden for our benefit. So let's talk. I just want to talk briefly, and I know you said you're not making this, but I'm going to talk about briefly about the ontological distinctions. From one, God is omniscient. He can see eternity. He can see, for example, our life is a mere blip compared to eternity with him. So he's going to be able to see all of that into perspective here when he's talking about it. Furthermore, God is also on a plane of existence different than us that he can see. So when someone dies, they don't just go out of God's presence. Like if a kid were to die in front of his own father, they're now outside of his initial experience. He doesn't know what happened to them. That's not the same with God. I think if we're going to compare fathers to children, I think we need to compare it like in the movie Inception. So because they are able to go down different dreams when he's talking about it. Furthermore, God is also on a plane of existence different than us that he can see. So vanish. It's because Tyler has scared me away with his powerful arguments. That's obviously.
It's hidden for our benefit.
Let's talk about. So hidden for our benefit. So let's talk. I just want to talk briefly, and I know you said you're not making this, but I'm going to talk about briefly about the ontological distinctions. From one, God is omniscient. He can see eternity. He can see, for example, our life is a mere blip compared to eternity with him. So he's going to be able to see all of that into perspective here when he's talking about it. Furthermore, God is also on a plane of existence different than us that he can see. So when someone dies, they don't just go out of God's presence. Like if a kid were to die in front of his own father, they're now outside of his initial experience. He doesn't know what happened to them. That's not the same with God. I think if we're going to compare fathers to children, I think we need to compare it like in the movie Inception. So because they are able to go down different dream levels, and sometimes in the dream levels in the movie Inception, they shoot each other to help each other, despite it seeming like the wrong thing to do if they were in that part of the dream and they forgot they were in a dream. So at one point, the main character, Leonardo DiCaprio, takes Ellen Page, I believe, into a dream, and he lets the people in the dream basically almost like take her and kill her because he's trying to teach her about how to activate in the dream world. Now, if that was in the real world, we'd be like, don't do that. But we understand because it's in a dream world, he's using it for, soul building or better understanding of how to navigate the world of Inception and all that types of things. So we need to think of it more like that. Now, when we talk about God being a loving father, I think we need to remember when we're going to make this analogy, we can't think of people as purely innocent and good if we're going to talk about in terms of God's understanding or the Christian understanding. We need to think of it more like God would be hidden from orcs in Lord of the Rings, because quite frankly, I think humans in this reality are going to better match orcs in Tolkien's world. And I think, for example, if, the God shows up, Eru Iluvatar, the orcs aren't going to worship him and love him. They're going to try to kill him, use him, these types of things. So he would have to use various means to bring them closer to him. It's like what C.S. Lewis talks about in his book, Till We Have Faces. It's not that God is hidden from us, it's that we don't have faces yet. We've not reached the point where we can truly love him as we are supposed to, because we are so far distant from him. So he is bringing dust to him. He is loving us, and he's going to use his understanding of knowledge and the future to bring all that he can, who will freely accept and love him as best as he possibly can. And again, if there are non-resistant non-believers that die, that process can still continue on after death, I would argue.
By the way, you might have already won me over just by bringing up Inception, because it's my favorite movie. I think it's one of the best movies ever made. But a couple of things, right? So I guess I would say, well, the problem is that the reason why they can shoot someone in a different layer of Inception is because that's not the real world, right? So there's a crunchiness that comes with it being the real world. Like you can shoot someone in the real world to wake them up in the actual world. So in order for that analogy to work, it seems like you almost have to be arguing metaphysically that this isn't the real world, right? But clearly,
I'm an idealist.
What's that?
I'm an idealist.
I understand that you're an idealist, but it's not that. So our plane of existence, though, it's not that we go from a different plane of existence to another plane of existence, right? It's just that we exist in a different plane of existence than say God exists, or whatever it is.
I think actually Michael could argue this, if you get really foundational. So like Tyler's saying, for the comparison to work, this world. So in Inception, the comparison is disanalogous because in Inception you're in a dream world, and so doing bad things to you in the dream world is okay because it doesn't actually harm you in the real world. And so he would have to argue the same for this world compared to eternity or whatever. And I think you actually could make that argument if you wanted to by saying, like, in dreams, you actually are, to some degree, committing a little bit of harm. Now, it's not much compared to how you would experience it in the real world, but it does. That harm you experience in the dream world is something that you like think about, and it does affect your day-to-day experience in the real world. Now, it might not affect it much, but it still does. And so because of that, so like shooting you, for example, it's nowhere near the effect as it would in the real world, but it still does have some degree of an effect. And so you could argue in the same sense that, like, in this world, the stuff that God does to us that doesn't really make sense, the hiddenness, etc., it's, to us, it seems like it has a big effect, but in reality, when you look at this world versus the next world, it would have such a small and minor effect on the next world, where it actually would make sense when you look at it from the big picture. And so, like, them shooting us, doing those bad things in the dream world, has a negative effect immediately that's so small that they don't even really think about it. And but in the real world, it actually is really important for them, and it has a big effect. And so in the same way, for us, the hiddenness that we experience of God could have that, like, harmful effect that feels big right now, but in reality, it's pretty small in comparison. And in the second world, we would experience the goodness that comes from God hiding from us. I think Michael could definitely make that argument. But
whatever you can make out of saying God exists in a plane of existence, I'm not. Anyways, so and then for the C.S. Lewis, or not C.S. Lewis, the Narnia example, I'd say, well, the difference is that works aren't made in the image of J.R.R. Tolkien, right? In the biblical narrative, I mean, as humans, all humans are made in the image of God, right? So we're not made in the image of Sauron, right? We're made in the image of God. So I would say that seems to be, again, I know I'm poking holes in the analogy, but it's why I don't think that those types of analogies work. I think the more interesting one is the Till We Have Faces, right? So C.S. Lewis asking, why must holy places be dark places? And he's trying to answer this question. You're right. He's trying to say, well, The reason why is because we can't see God face to face until we have faces, until we can see him. We don't have the mechanisms to see him face to face. But this is where, I used to really appreciate Lewis on that. By the way, Peter Kraft has a great series where he gives talks to the C.S. Lewis books, which I highly recommend. They're fantastic. But here I would just come back and say, well, why couldn't God have just created us with faces? Like, again, the problem that I think Hiddenness gets to is kind of, and I don't mean to say this crassly, it's a problem of garbage in, garbage out. If you start off with saying, well, we're already garbage, and I don't mean that in the saying, well, human beings are garbage in value, but I'm saying you're already starting with it's broken code. Then you can reverse engineer and you can come up with these answers and say, okay, well, there's this way out of broken code, right? I'm just going to say, well, why start with, why have there be broken code? It doesn't, we could have been made with faces. We could have been made that.
Okay, so it kind of seems like Tyler's saying, in this world, hiddenness might make sense. For achieving God's goal. But there is a different world God could have made without hiddenness. Without these flaws, including hiddenness, that would be better in achieving God's goals. So, like, and it's important to say the distinction. Oops. A flaw like hiddenness might make sense. Without these flaws, like hiddenness, without flaws, that would require hiddenness, that would be better in achieving God's goals. I think that's kind of what he's saying.
We could have been made.
And I was talking about this earlier in the last stream, like if that makes sense for an argument in divine hiddenness, or if this is a separate argument. And I can't remember. I think I lean more towards it is being a separate argument but I also do kind of feel like it is the same argument. But I mean, I just wish they would kind of put it in a syllogistic form. Divine hiddenness argument, because like divine hiddenness doesn't have to be super strict only hiddenness. I don't think you could make it that way, but arguments don't always have to follow in that way. Like they can have a little bit more nuance to them, and I don't know. I just wish they kind of. I love I've seen debates with Michael where they do syllogisms, like God. The argument, divine hiddenness argument might be like, premise 1, P1. This is the argument I think Tyler might make with the syllogism. God. especially with the internal critique, I feel like a syllogism is almost necessary. Because you gotta figure out what are the agreed upon ones and where's the disagreement at. We are called to love like God. P2. God loves like God loves by hiding. P3. We are not called to hide. Conclusion. We are not called to love like God. So these are all premises that the Bible would support, and then this is the conclusion that follows from the Bible's premises, and this is a contradiction from one of the premises. I think that like and then like what would Michael disagree with? He'd disagree with premise 1. And I just feel like the conversation would be so much more productive. Because you would say, like, God always. You'd be like, no, we're not always called to love like God. Like, it depends on the context. Like, if we were in God's position, or maybe it would, maybe he would agree with this. Like, we are called to love by God. God loves by hiding. We are not called to hide. No, he would disagree with premise 1. We're not always called to love like God because our situations are not. Like, we're called to love by God if we're in those relevant situations. God loves by hiding when there's relevant situations. But we are, maybe he disagrees with premise 3. We're not called to hide in those relevant situations. Like you'd have to like expand upon like the 3 premises, I guess. But this would just make the debate way better if they did a syllogism. Like, why don't they just do that?
We could have been made in an eternal blessed state. In the same way that the trans-world righteous angels were, right? If you're sympathetic to Molinism and that type of metaphysics, right? So there were beings that aren't trans-world depraved. And again, I don't think trans-world depravity is a right category. I'm trying to apply this to multiple theologies, right? So there are those who say, well, trans-world depravity, it couldn't be, and I'm just saying, well, there in theory a nearly infinite amount of beings who weren't trans-world depraved. Make a world with an infinite amount of those ones, and then you don't have the fault, right? There seems to be lots of logically possible and feasible worlds where we wouldn't have started with the broken code to begin with.
Mm-hmm. So, real quick on the whole, this is not the real world. I'd recommend, just on as a side note, there's a paper by Gabriel Citron, Dreams, Nightmares, in a defensive argument and in a defense against arguments from evil. So he argues that perhaps like when we die, we go to a more real plane of existence kind of thing. And that would also, at the eschaton, that's the new heaven and new earth. It's this world being transformed and brought into some sort of new, deeper reality as well. But so you brought up the idea, why not create us with faces? Why not create us in that world? Well, I mean, from the Christian perspective, if this is an internal critique, that doesn't necessarily guarantee everyone will be saved, because we know of Satan and the demons. We know that there was still rebellion with that kind of aspect. And so it doesn't necessarily work. And God can create cognitively robust theism on this plane of existence through these processes of triumph, of creating robust thing. And that would also, at the eschaton, that's the new heaven and new earth. It's this world being transformed and brought into some sort of new, deeper reality as well. But so you brought up the idea, why not create us with faces? Why not create us in that world? Well, I mean, from the Christian perspective, if this is an internal critique, that doesn't necessarily guarantee everyone will be saved, because we know of Satan and the demons. We know that there was still rebellion with that kind of aspect. And so it doesn't necessarily work. And God can create cognitively robust theism on this plane of existence through these processes of creating more triumphant good, expanding virtue. And it's also the process itself that I believe is very important for creating the virtue. So again, let's go back to Frodo in Lord of the Rings, for example. So Frodo, like, could God just have created Frodo with this already, the type of character he had when he got back to the Shire? I guess so, but again, would it have really have been that authentic, good, triumphant virtue without the story behind it? And I think going through the process itself creates, I guess you could say, more of a grassroots type of virtue instead of like an astroturf. It's going through the story, going through the motions. This is also why God, I mean, the story of Scripture. There is a story process going through it. Jesus himself becomes man, goes through the process, has his own life, his own story. It's because there's something about going through the process itself that is able to create very unique types of virtue, very unique types of soul buildings, very unique stories ultimately. And I would say that's all sort of collected together as a good reason for why God would allow this type of process to unfold. It's not just this idea that, yeah, he could create us like that, but A, it could still cause rebellion. So why not allow for really cool processes, really cool stories, and really cool virtue and soul building ultimately? If it's not going to guarantee that it were created directly in God's presence, like perhaps Satan and many of the demons, then why not allow for these really cool processes and stories and still have the triumphant good?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would go back and say, well, God didn't have to create Satan. That's the whole point, right? I mean, he's omniscient. He knew the nearly infinite amount of beings who would have never fallen. He could have created those to begin with rather than the ones that he did create. And I guess I would go back and say, well, I mean, okay, I think there's objections based on what you said about Jesus that I can push. Again, I think a lot of these objections are, kind of have that bump in the carpet thing. I push it down here. I think if I push on that one, we're gonna pop up in problems with hypostatic union. So I'll leave that for now because it's not really the topic. But I would just say, well, if it's a trade-off between robust virtue for a select handful of people like Frodo in the Shire, at the expense of rape, genocide, murder, torture, all that, eternal damnation, annihilation, all that kind of stuff for billions of people, then yeah, the trade-off might be better that Frodo was just created with that type of virtue to begin with. But also, it seems to me that type of virtue can be, it doesn't just have to be de facto; it can be de jure by nature, right? I mean, Jesus ostensibly apparently has that, right? He was created in every way like us, but without sin, right? So there was something in that you're not a Catholic, so you don't think the Immaculate Conception.
I don't say if I'm Catholic or not. I keep that.
Okay, so I haven't seen you affirm the Immaculate Conception of Mary as a means to explain why sin did not enter into the heritage of Jesus. Barring that, whatever it is, whatever process was there that did that for the humanity of Jesus, that still allowed him to have virtue. God could have done that for every single person, right? He could have prevented, right? So I think a lot about the metaphysics of creation, right? Because it comes up a lot in free will and all that kind of stuff. God could have made it so that the fall didn't have this metaphysical impact on nature, on humanity, on the will, on the Constitution. Right? It could have been a localized event with just a moral implication. Why did it have to why did it have to fundamentally alter the nature of humanity such that all are fallen in Adam? Right? God set it up that way. It didn't have to be that way. I think it's a very weird position to say that God was somehow forced to create it such that if someone had a sin, it therefore impacted the metaphysical makeup of all of reality such that there's corruption wherever the curse is found, so to speak. That's an intentional choice. It didn't have to be that way. Right? So it seems to me that there are lots of ways that it could have been otherwise that wouldn't need this type of overcoming explanation. Right? You might be able to give good answers once there's a problem, garbage in, garbage out, but why start with the broken code to begin with? Could have made it completely different. And you still would have had the same positive outcomes. You still would have had soul building, you still could have had robust cognitive belief, you still could have had all of those things without rape, genocide, torture, human trafficking, child sex trafficking, malaria, leukemia. You could have done without all those things.
So a lot there. Let me try to go through a lot of this. So let's just sort of work backwards here. So when you say why start out to be broken to begin with, again, this is not really divine hiddenness. It's more like moving into why even suffering exists to begin with. And I would again go back to the whole idea that when we're going to vote with our feet on this, our actions are going to speak louder than words. We're going to seek out the really interesting world building stories where there is a lot of evil, a lot of suffering, because the more there is, the more triumphant it is at some point.
So he's kind of saying. So Tyler would say something like, we can consider better worlds. And Michael's saying, maybe this world, with the amount, the more evil overcome, the better. And perhaps this world is the perfect world because any more evil and it wouldn't be overcome, any less and it wouldn't be as virtuous as it could be with evil still being overcome. So he would kind of say like this is the perfect amount of evil and good in the world.
And so we do recognize that triumphant good does come out of the defeat of evil. The best kind of triumphant good comes out of the defeat of evil. But you can't have that unless there is evil to begin with. And so in my video on suffering, I note that God has imbued in the universe this idea of a law of triumph, where that if a creature encounters suffering, if he chooses, he may allow that suffering to start to sanctify him, to build him into a better person, so that all the evil slowly just becomes used for his soul building in some regard. Now, let's talk about the whole idea that you brought up Frodo, why do you have to create that world with all the rape and the torture if it's only going to help a select people? Well, I don't think that's the case at all. I think it can be for anyone. I mean, God is greater than Gerald Tolkien. And sure, he creates a world where there is suffering to benefit a select few, but I don't think God necessarily has to create that kind of world where there is just some suffering for just a select few. I think it's anybody who wants to participate in the process of sanctification and soul building more than willing can enter into that kind of process. Now, you asked, why did God create Satan when you first brought up? Well, again, it may just be that was just a necessary result. There would be some sort of cosmic leader of the dark forces regardless of what happened. To quote Doctor Strange in Infinity Wars, given that he was able to look at all these possible futures.
I think I'm gonna eat some pretzels. Maybe. Because I'm hungry. Here's my lucid dreaming X. I had to keep remaking. So I'll be right back. Right back, okay? Um, I guess while I'm chewing, I'll mute. I guess this is mute, maybe.
Tony, there was no other way. At some point, this may be the best of all possible worlds, where there still is triumphant good and evil is ultimately defeated, as Erasmus and Stratton say in their paper on this idea. It could very well be the case. From our limited perspective, we cannot necessarily use this aspect to say that somehow that God will be evidence that God doesn't exist due to that limited aspect. God could very well have everything in view and know that this would be the best possible worlds where there is enough soul building, or at least one of the best possible worlds if there's multiple equal ones, where there is enough soul building, there is triumphant good. And so I don't think that necessarily is a huge problem, because ultimately you could make the case for triumphant good at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, and I think we're getting close to time, but I mean, I guess I would respond in a couple of ways, right? Because this is, and I'll bring it back to divine hiddenness. So I know we've gotten into this stuff, and I'm not sure it's entirely avoidable when we talk about hiddenness to get into something, but like it seems to me that divine hiddenness exacerbates the problem. That's why.
Okay, so it seems like Michael's saying, if you grant that more triumphant good means better world, then always means better world, maybe. Then against this world, because this could be the perfect combination. Before hearing something like what he said, I would think like, what? Come on, man, you're just saying like we have no idea, so you can't argue against it, because maybe what if it is? But it's only if you grant this. If you don't grant this, then you don't have to accept. Then you can argue against the world. But Michael's saying like, okay, well, if we can assume this, then yes, you can argue against this, which I would agree with. I would agree with this whole thing. But I wouldn't agree with the beginning. If I was to agree with the beginning, I would agree with him. But I wouldn't agree with the beginning. I don't know if Tyler recognizes this.
It comes up, right? Because I can think of, well, imagine a worldwide Damascus Road experience. Just call it every 500 years. Across every culture, every civilization, every nation, universally reported that there's this Damascus Road experience. It's all in a bit, right? Because the way that I look at it is, well, I mean, especially Christian apologists, they're gonna say this is the type of evidence that we find convincing for the resurrection. The resurrection was the exemplar of the opposite of divine hiddenness, right? This is Emmanuel. This is God with us. This is God appearing, right? This is the opposite of divine hiddenness, right? And this is the type of evidence that we find convincing of Emmanuel, of God with us, of that He cares and He's right? And I would say, well, okay, if that's what is good evidence, then surely having more of that evidence would be better, right? You have if you have this universal, right? If you have testimony from a handful of eyewitnesses of the resurrection of Jesus, which is debatable, but let's just grant it, and that is convincing of the resurrection, or you think should be reasonably convincing of the resurrection, how much more convincing would it have been to have a universal, experience, even at the time of Jesus, written about across every single culture, every single language, it all happened in the same year, all that kind of stuff. If you had that evidence, I guarantee as an apologist, you'd be jumping up and down with joy if you suddenly discovered this cache of papyri or stones across all nations, all times, they're all dated. You all would love it. It'd be fantastic. You wouldn't be like, oh, well, like that's taking away freedom. That's making, that's making it's making it not as triumphant, right? We could think of these trivial ways where God could have been less hidden, and it would have led to more cognitively robust belief, more salvation, more, right? And that's just one small example. And it's the type of evidence that I think that you would accept for the resurrection, for a lack of divine hiddenness, right? So it seems that there's this tension between trying to explain away divine hiddenness, but also wanting that evidence and really, really wanting it to be reasonable to believe that God wasn't hidden in this one instance as a virtue. I think that there's the tension between those two things.
So, I mean, I think there's a lot here I want to say here. So I wrote a bunch of notes down. So more evidence would be better. I mean, it could be, it could not be. I mean, as Jesus said, they have Moses and the prophets. If they won't listen to Moses and the prophets, they would not be convinced even if someone were to rise from the dead. Let's use an analogy here. Let's use Christians as the sample. Let's say that Hinduism is true. And let's say a prophet starts coming into America and he's raising the dead, and he's declaring Krishna as Lord, and he's healing the blind. Tyler, do you think James White is going to close up shop? Do you think Jeff Durbin is going to close up shop? Or do you think very well they might do what the Pharisees did? That he's casting out demons in the name of Beelzebub. You know, we got our presuppositionalists. I don't think Kenneth Copeland is going to close up shop. I don't think, Westboro Baptist Church is going to go away. So, this is something Paul Moser again talks about in his book on divine hiddenness, is that more evidence may not actually create the cognitively robust theism that we want. And if we're going to look at it internally from Christianity, when it happens at the Exodus, it doesn't work. The moment they get into Canaan, they immediately start worshiping other gods, and did that even before they went into Canaan. So there is this idea that if God is aware of everyone's motives even better than we are, then he can very well know that, no, that necessarily will not work. I mean, if they're not going to, as he said, if they're not going to listen to Moses and the prophets, more evidence isn't necessarily going to work. And again, we often think that, yeah, if we just got a little bit more something like that or that, we would get what we want. It goes back to my analogy I gave with dealing with my own viewers. A lot of them come to me and they have serious issues, they need answers. But in my experience of having done this for years, if I just keep feeding them answers and feeding them answers, it doesn't actually make them more interested in apologetics. It doesn't actually make them become better critical thinkers. It just makes them become super dependent on me. Now, that doesn't happen for all of them. Everybody's different. Look at Jesus does in the Gospel of John when Lazarus dies. Mary gets tears, Martha gets a sermon. Everyone's going to be different. So I'm not saying that's the case with everyone. But if there's an omniscient God out there, and he can know very well that if he gives certain people information, it may not actually lead to the cognitively robust theism. It could lead to a Pharisaic mindset. It could lead to people acting like they did at the Exodus. I mean, I just did a video, why Jesus hasn't returned yet. And I said, let's just say Jesus descended right now and said, I'm back, I'm king. Do we really think that the People's China Republic is going to disband? Is the Russian Federation going to pack up? I don't think so. I think people were going to try to use Jesus. They're going to try to make it fit with the system because we're simply not ready for that. And that's one of the reasons the video is subtly a post-millennialist message. We're just simply not ready to worship him as he wants. Like he says in Matthew 23, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. We as a people just simply aren't ready for that right now. And he says in John, it's better that I go away so that the Helper will come, because he will convict the world of sin. God in his omniscience knows this is a better process.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just say, well, I mean, then the imminence is gone. Jesus said, look, if they didn't believe in Moses the prophet, then it wouldn't basically, it wouldn't matter if someone raised from the dead. But then he raised from the dead, right? And it was expected that his resurrection from the dead would be valuable evidence to those who didn't have Moses and the prophets, right? He would go to the Gentiles, he'd go to the nations, he would convert Jews, right? I don't know if that passage can function that way, right? I don't know if it's a defeater for the problem of divine hiddenness, because Jesus himself basically says, look, yes, they have Moses and the prophets, but then he showed, resurrection should engender genuine belief, right? That's
I think Michael's gonna say, like, the hiddenness is context dependent. Like, God's not always hidden. Like, it's not black and white. It's not always hidden. But in some circumstances, it makes sense for God to be available. In some circumstances, it makes sense for God to hide. If his ultimate goal is cognitively robust theism, then it would make sense in a world like ours that he would hide in some circumstances and not hide in other circumstances. And we wouldn't expect him to always be hidden or always not be hidden, because it depends on the effect that it's going to have on the individual. And Tyler seems to think that it is black and white, and that if God wants cognitively robust theism, then he would always hide or he would always not hide, because they always have the same effect. Maybe?
That should be part of it. But then I would also say, well, why if that's the case, then again I'm going to go back to then why evangelize, right? If divine hiddenness is buffered, is supported by saying, well, they have Moses and the prophets, evidence might not engender, belief. It might engender the false belief. Well, then why would Christian apologists go around talking about evidence for the resurrection?
I think Michael's just going to say because we don't know. Maybe it will help them, maybe it won't. But God tells us to evangelize, so it makes sense to trust Him. Because just because we don't know 100% sure doesn't mean we shouldn't do a thing, right?
And why would more evidence for the resurrection, right? I don't think if you found, I don't think, and I'm not trying to psychologize or anything like that. I mean, this would have been me as as an apologist. If they suddenly found this cache of documents in China, right, at the exact same time, where you had these people that basically said that they had this vision of what was called, they said, oh, he showed up, they said his name was Jesus, and all that kind of stuff, and it was veridical. Somehow we could rule out forgery and fakes, and later, all that kind of stuff. Christian apologists would be thrilled to use it as evidence, right? They wouldn't be like, oh, well, more evidence, that might not work, right? Because they would understand the more evidence for the claim would be better. And I'm not sure that your example of the follower helps, because that's truncating functional knowledge. That's saying I can't do it for you. I can't force you to know how to do research, how to do apologetics, all that kind of stuff. I can't do it for you. I'm truncating your functional knowledge. That's different than relational knowledge. That's different than to know someone in the biblical sense, so to speak. That's different than that type of father-child relationship, right? I don't hide myself from my sons because I said, oh, well, if I didn't hide myself, then you wouldn't know how to relate to me or something like that. We don't collapse that type of functional skill knowledge of how to do something with personal interrelationship knowledge of someone. And so I think that your attempted analogy of saying, well, I do this, if I do this for my followers, they don't learn how to do it. That's not analogous to saying I would hide from my children that way, because otherwise, if I don't hide, they're not going to learn it for themselves, right? We don't do that in relational knowledge. I think that your attempted analogy of saying, well, I do this, if I do this for my followers, they don't learn how to do it. That's not analogous to saying I would hide from my children that way, because otherwise, if I don't hide, they're not going to learn it for themselves, right? We don't do that in relational knowledge.
I think Michael's response is, which that's a fair point, but I think Michael's response is just going to be, but God's has infinite knowledge, so He knows if it will work or not. Like what will work in accomplishing that, and we can consider like more often than not, we know that treating a child like that is not going to help, so if we don't do that. But if we knew for a fact that it would help the child, uh, we could think about some ways that could actually end up benefiting the child, and we would do that, and so that we could just assume that the same works with God.
Well, I mean, again, God can create a world where we can have relational knowledge without just basic theism or overwhelming evidence where no one can deny it. Then I don't see that's necessarily the case that He has to provide that, especially if there's evidence that it will get in the way of our own sanctification. And you brought up, the whole resurrection thing. Well, notice how the early Christians argued. They argued from the scriptures itself. They argued from the testimony and from what the apostles were saying. So they're arguing from basically the word and the word inspired by the Holy Spirit at that time, not necessarily saying like, yes, you can go and he'll make some big grand appearance to you, that kind of thing. Again, you brought up why the evangelize thing. Well, again, it seems like the only issue that this is being taken into is like it's just to avoid hell. But again, we believe as Christians we evangelize because we want to make the world a better place. We want to make people find their true fulfillment and their true happiness. We believe that is in Christianity. So it's not just about getting fire insurance out to everyone. It's about making people have their eudaimonia moment, have their eudaimonia experience, and truly come to this. And yeah, if there was a cache found of these documents in faraway China, I think Christians would rejoice. I don't think Muslims would. And again, I go back to my example of the Hindu prophet. Again, I do not think if Hinduism was true and there was a Hindu prophet running around America doing things like Jesus did, that Christians are going to close up church. I recognize that Christians can be just as stubborn as non-Christians, can be just committed emotionally to their beliefs as non-Christians can be. And this is why I think one of the beautiful aspects of Christianity is that we're saved by grace, not of works or that kind of aspect, because we understand that at some point there is a grace aspect there. With my analogy of talking to my own followers and what, now I don't, it goes back to the idea that I have to stay hidden to some degree, because if I'm in their face so much, it doesn't actually create the soul building I think that they would need to go through. It would be more like this just basic idea that they just keep coming to me, this kind of thing. Kind of like what the Israelites did in the Exodus wilderness period. They just came to God when they had a problem. And then when he was gone and they got their land, well, now we got other gods we can worship. It was that just kind of idea. It didn't build a loving relationship where people sacrifice to God because they want to, or they come to the tabernacle because they want to. And so I think in some regards, me staying hidden has actually helped some people become better critical thinkers. Because when recently I checked a message someone sent me, and he said, "Hey, help me with this." And then like a week later, I saw another message. Actually, I figured it out. Never mind. I'm like, yes, that's what I was hoping for. So me actually staying hidden in that regard actually led to him figuring out his own issue. And I think in some regard, he actually became a smarter person in the long run.
Yeah, but I would say you weren't hidden, right? You were available. He knew how to message you. He knew how to reach you. He knew your name. He knew what you looked like.
Yeah, we can pray to God.
There's lots of knowledge about you that's directly available to that person, right?
Yeah, I could say the same with the Bible.
Yeah, but then I would say, okay, I mean, granted, I understand that we're dealing with an internal critique, right? This is where I am going to say, well, then I would just push back and say, okay, well, now I'm just cognizantly moving to an external critique and saying, okay, great. Now can you prove to me that the Bible actually is the inspired word of God, right? Now this is where I am going to say, well, then I would just...
Wait, what is the... On which point? Which point is he granting?
Someone sent me, and he said, "Hey, help me with this." And then like a week later,
they're talking about hiding makes sense in certain scenarios. Okay.
So actually available. He knew how to message you. He knew how to reach you. He knew your name. He knew what you looked like.
Yeah, we can pray to God.
There's lots of knowledge about you that's directly available to that person, right?
Yeah, I could say the same with the Bible.
Yeah, but then I would say, okay, I mean, granted, I understand that we're dealing with an internal critique, right? This is where I am going to say, well, then I would just push back and say, okay, well, now I'm just cognizantly moving to an external critique and saying, okay, great. Now can you prove to me that the Bible actually is the inspired word of God, right? Because in order to justify that claim, I would say, okay, well, if that's the if you're going to go on that as a defense, I'm going to say fine, but that now, right? So, okay, let me. You've hit on something I think is important, just dialectically, that people should understand. Internal critique, right? I'm saying if we take Christianity as true for the sake of argument, right? There's this internal problem. I can't go to external arguments. I can't go to external facts, right? That's not a valid way to argue. This is one of my pet peeves all times when we're talking about free will and we're talking with atheists about theism and all that kind of stuff, right? So I can't help myself to these ideas outside of Christianity, because then I would be invalidating. Mm-hmm. But I'm going to say, okay, well, now there's this internal critique, right? And let's say it's 20 points long. To answer one point of it, you need to now rely on the Bible being this inspired word of the revelation from God. I'm gonna say, okay, let's pause.
Wait, we can assume that the Bible is the inspired word of God, and still the person doesn't know that. I don't think he has to move to an external critique here. I don't know why he did that. That's kind of a weird point. We can assume that it is, but not everybody knows that. That's the issue. The whole issue is that they don't know that.
Pause now Because to answer this
Kind of weird.
one part of divine hiddenness, now you're appealing to something. I'm saying, okay, fine, let's put a pin in that. Now, externally, can you give me independent reason to think that that's the case, right? You're not, by the way, for the audience and for you, I'm not expecting you to do that right now. There's no way in the world we have time constraints. So I'm not saying you like can't do that or you haven't met your burden if you don't or anything like that. Just, I'm acknowledging that now we would probably shift to an entirely different topic to demonstrate the Bible. So I'm actually, hopefully, coming to your defense and saying, let's put a pin in that, but I'm not, it's not that you haven't met your burden or anything like that. That would just take us too far.
Well, real quick, this is my point though. When we get through the weeds of divine hiddenness, I mean, really we shift to other arguments like, is this really true? And I think that's where the conversation that Christians and non-Christians need to have. I don't think divine hiddenness is really that much of an internal issue, because when we hack through all the weeds, where do we end up? Well, is the Bible really true? Exactly. That's where the conversation ultimately ends with divine hiddenness. Because once we get through all the weeds, we realize that maybe we should be having a conversation about an external critique, not the internal one isn't really getting us there.
Well, I think it's both, right? Because I mean, I still think there's strong internal tensions, right? I think you have major tensions when it comes around evangelism, when it comes around, the problem of what it means to be a loving father. I think there are all these kinds of things. It's just on that one point, you now need the scriptures to come in to overcome it. And I'm saying, okay, well, for that one point, now we would have to switch external. I don't think that it's I love you, but I don't think you've hacked through all the issues to solve all of the internal issues that are there. It's just now at this one we've hit a terminus where we have to switch from external for this one point.
Well,
Mike, you have one final comment to respond to Tyler? Then we can end it at that and go to Q&A.
I have one or two sentences. So, yeah, I totally agree, Tyler. I only had an hour to really deal with these few internal issues. I think given another 5 hours, we can hammer out even more problems. And so I agree. I didn't have time to get every internal issue, but I think they can be addressed.
All right. Thank you guys for a lovely conversation. I was just joyful delight back here. The audience was enjoying it as well. And the moderator.
All right, that's it. Next they go into Q&A, which I don't care about. So I guess I'll go like, I'll do one of these. Go here. Go here. Michael. Tyler. DH. I go boom. Then I go boom. I go boom, boom. Boom. And now my notes are saved. So then we can go boom and watch another video, folks. We can actually. Oh, Logan Paul did an interview with Kevin Durant. Okay, so now I'll watch another video for Divine Hiddenness. Damn, they had a 4-hour conversation. Is there non-resistant non-belief? That's interesting.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. We are joined once again by Dr. Stephen Napier, friend of mine out of Villanova. He's been on the show several times, at least maybe 4 or 5 times now over the years. It's always a joy to be chatting with you, Stephen. We're already having a good conversation backstage, as it always goes. I was chat with that. I'm like, oh, we should have recorded that, and then we missed all the good. You missed listeners. You missed all the good stuff. It's gone forever. Problem of evil. That's just, it is what it is. And we're going to try and deal with it today. And we're going to deal with a specific, well, I know this is a debate, right? Is like, is the problem of divine hiddenness, a species of the problem of evil, or is it really a different issue? But either way, we're going to talk about the problem of divine hiddenness. You have a new article, a very provocative and very good article that was just published in Religious Studies. Is there non-resistant non-belief? This is a central component of the...
It's kind of...
Oh man, that stinks. I can't listen through 57 minutes of that. I mean, maybe I could turn it down so I don't hear it.
Responses to the problem of divine hiddenness over the years as well, if that sounds good to you.
Yeah, so that's a great place to start. So I think the best way to explain the argument from divine hiddenness is to actually begin by disambiguating it from the problem of evil. Because that kind of shines a light on precisely what the problem is. So we can imagine, Peter Van Inwouden has us imagine a world where there's no evil. Absolutely no evil. No one does any evil. There's no moral evil. There's no earthquakes. There's no tornadoes.
Oh, I can't listen to it. Dang, that sucks.
reflection or through religious experience, it'd be very bizarre indeed for me to kind of put my eye down a microscope.
That's a really helpful way into the argument. So yeah, and I think we meet this in a kind of non-philosophical form quite a lot, don't we, Luke? Because it's, people saying, well, I haven't, I'm open to God, but God hasn't shown up in my life. So surely it's down to God in the end. And if God's there, then God will know what to do to make me believe, and that kind of thing. So yeah, where do you start with this one?
Yeah, definitely. And I would also add, I think it's something that even the Christian or the believer can relate to, in the sense that they will experience, periods or times where they feel like, well, where is God? I can read the Bible or go to church, but it feels like there is nothing tangible or nothing relatable. So in this sense, I do think that intuitively the argument makes sense, and or should make sense, I think, even to the Christian. Now, just very generally speaking, like one of the responses or one of the basic things to think about when divine hiddenness comes up is this: if, like, on what grounds are we to believe that this one argument, if you refer to how Schellenberg put it, the argument from divine hiddenness against God's existence, in what sense are we to believe that the assertion or the perception of the skeptic or of someone like Schellenberg that there isn't enough evidence for God kind of throws out all we know from natural theology and does so objectively speaking? So it seems like you have divine hiddenness as an argument on the one side, and on the other side you have all the data you get, or all the arguments you get from natural theology. And it seems like on a very basic level that the argument as such seems to kind of claim that all of this needs to be put aside, because natural theology as such is basically,
I think that's fine.
You look at the world as it is, you don't need special revelation, and with the data you get, you can make inference to the existence of God. So I think that's one of the basic issues that you would want to look at when the argument comes up.
So the point being that the fact that there is this objection of the hiddenness of God doesn't necessarily outweigh all of those other issues.
Exactly, because again, when you look at fine-tuning or cosmological arguments, I mean, these are ways that even atheist thinkers would say. And I mean, Alex, you've made kind of comments recently where you feel like, well, there has been raised credence in these arguments with how you've looked at them again.
Yeah.
So the question is, well, now, like, what weighs heavier? Is it the divine hiddenness argument, which basically says there is not enough evidence for a person to believe in God, or is it the stuff that is being talked about in natural theology? So
what do you want to say to that, Alex?
Well, the divine hiddenness problem, I don't think I would characterize it as the problem that there sort of isn't enough evidence per se. It's more something about the effect that evidence has on the person who's considering belief. So, I think there's a great deal of good evidence in terms of what is argumentatively sound. The fine-tuning argument, you can make responses to it, but it's a powerful consideration. Why are the consonants so finely tuned? The argument from reason seems to be a powerful sort of undercutting reason to sort of distrust our very reasoning faculties and atheism. These kinds of things, I think they are powerful argumentatively. In a kind of academic sense, they're easy to defend and difficult to argue against. But of course, particularly for Christianity, religion is not about natural theology. Natural theology is this strange philosophical wart on the side of what is supposed to be this glorious relationship with a loving person.
I don't know if the natural theologians will appreciate being compared to a wart, but
perhaps
we'll
not.
let that go.
But I feel like it's such a. It seems to me, if Christianity were true, it would be the sort of wrong way to be approaching this kind of conversation.
In practice, we don't all walk around as philosophers, when we're Christians, and I've always worried slightly that maybe a lot of the non-Christians and atheists who watch these shows and yours think that, well, this must be what Christianity is. If I was a Christian, I'd just be going around quoting the ontological argument or something, and that's not quite the reality.
Well, I think it rises up as a response to sort of your intellectual atheists of history who said, look, we've got this kind of academic way of viewing the world. We like to put things in a microscope. We like to formalize and mathematize this kind of thing, and we've sort of tried to sort of taxonomize the entire world into this complete scientific understanding that if we manage to fill out will explain everything, and the theist comes along and says, well, actually, I'm not so sure about that, and they start sort of arguing on those terms, and you end up with this highly academic, formalized premise conclusion, which of course I find interesting. I've made a career out of discussing this stuff for the past half decade, but of course I'm an atheist, right? Like I think that this is sort of interesting from a philosophical perspective, but if I were a Christian, I would think that this is not where I would expect to find the focal point of the Christian faith. This is supposed to be about a relationship. I think, look, if God has not revealed himself through prayer or reflection or through religious experience, it'd be very bizarre indeed for me to kind of put my eye down a microscope, look at like a particular way that an atom wriggles or something, and go, there he is. You know, it'd be a very strange place for him to reveal himself. And so I wouldn't expect. So when I say that sort of the natural theological arguments, they're argumentatively sound, I think they are, but they don't move me, and I don't think they move a lot of people. And I think if you ask people why they convert to Christianity or to theism from atheism, very rarely do they report that it's because they sat down and read a particular argument in the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology.
Sometimes that is part of a wider picture. Obviously, there is some kind of intellectual questions that got answered, and then perhaps there was also an additional experience or whatever. But yeah, how would you want to respond, Lucas?
Yeah, so let me just rephrase that back to you, just in order to make sure I understand you properly. So are you basically saying that there needs to be a way to experience God, or to have like an experiential aspect to your relationship to God, rather than just an intellectual kind of wrestling and argumenting?
I went on a strange detour, but I didn't actually. I think I didn't actually quite get to the point, which is my fault. Which is that if there is a lot of evidence, the problem is not so much whether that evidence has been provided, but why that evidence doesn't move a person. Because you could provide all the evidence in the world, but if I'm just of this kind of psychological constitution where it just doesn't land with me, you could say something like, there's a sense in which you might want to say, well, that's kind of on you because there is enough evidence and you're just not accepting it for some reason. But whatever that reason is as mysterious to me as it is to you. Like, why is it that somebody will say to me, look, you have all of this evidence, fine for me, like your moral intuition, all of this kind of stuff. Like, why are you not a theist? To which I just want to say, well, that's a good question. Why not? Why is it, indeed, that in the face of all of these supposed evidences, I am just not moved? Now, it might be something to do with me. It might be that I'm doing it wrong. It might be that I'm sort of not opening my heart to God. But I at least feel as though I've done that. And I'd like to ask any theist who thinks I'm not what they would advise that I do if they think that I've not been doing it properly.
Maybe like, you would expect someone in Alex's position to have been moved by now. And yet, not. How does this make sense?
But so it's not so much about the evidence, but rather the sort of lack of potency that the evidence has in actually forming a belief within a person.
Okay, so I guess then we're really talking about, a person like yourself looking at the evidence, and I think that the crucial term there is it doesn't move you. So what do you? I mean, could you kind of mention another example where the evidence moves you to to action, or to whatever it's supposed to move you towards? Because I feel like I can look at, I don't know, I can look at any piece of evidence about anything, I don't know, about trees, or I don't know, transportation, whatever, and not be moved by it. The question is, well, why should a piece of data, or like a body of data, move me to anything? I'm not trying to kind of to trick you or to undermine you in any sense, but just trying to understand, what do you understand under this term that evidence should move you? Because
oh man, I didn't realize I was muted that whole time.
Presented with evidence, and if something makes sense to you, then the most reasonable thing is for you to act in accordance with it. I mean, take the example of smoking. I mean, it's quite out of question that smoking damages your health. So that means that, well, people should be moved to not smoke, but that's not what happened. So the question is, or it seems to me that the problem is not with the evidence as such, which can or cannot move people to do something or to act in a certain way. So what is this moving what do you think? I mean, I'm just curious to add the quite out of question that smoking damages your health. So that means that, well, people should be moved to not smoke, but that's not what happened. So the question is, or it seems to me that the problem is not with the evidence as such, which can or cannot move people to do something or to act in a certain way. So what is this moving what do you think? I mean, I'm just curious.
There are some arguments that I have experienced that have
What do you then I and not be, I can look at, I don't know, I can look at any piece of evidence about anything, I don't know, about, trees or about transportation, whatever, and not be moved by it. The question is, well, why should a piece of data or like a body of data?
Okay, so he's asking, why should we expect evidence to move people? Seems like he's asking.
I mean, it makes sense, but I don't if thing, right? But when you're talking about they seem valid arguments to believe that can argue something. I have experience that have sort of
what touch, which can or cannot people to do something or to act in a certain way. So what do you think? I mean,
there are some arguments that I have and it happens non-consensually. This is the weird thing about becoming convinced of an argument. It just sort of happens to you, right? And so for example, when I first started considering arguments surrounding free will, when I was like 17 or something, and I'd never really thought about it, and I listened to the audiobook of Sam Harris's book about free will, and I'm just kind of staring off into space like, this is incredible. And that seemed to have an effect. And I think that the reason has got something to do with maybe if you can present a sort of valid syllogism, a deductive argument in which I sort of believe the premises, then I have no choice but to believe the conclusion. And so natural theology has a number of deductive arguments, like the Kalam cosmological argument or the ontological argument or something. And I'm when I say that these arguments are sound and I think that they're successful, what I mean is that they're valid, that they do actually work, and that the premises sort of they seem intuitive. We have some good reason. To believe them, but of course it all rides on exactly what you give to those premises. And so when you're talking about something like smoking, we have fairly well-defined parameters. We know what sort of health means. We've defined it for our own purposes. We know the effects that smoking has on a body, this kind of thing, right? But when you're talking about everything that begins to exist has a cause, sure, yeah, I mean, that makes sense. Because I guess if it didn't, then wouldn't this kind of thing happen all the time? Like maybe, but I don't know. Like there's such a different grasp that we have on these kinds of considerations that, like, yeah, I think the argument's valid, and I think sure, I mean, it makes sense that everything that begins to exist has a cause, but it doesn't have the same kind of undeniable force. And the only other thing is that because this is attached to a worldview that says that this is a God who is the author of the universe and has created the universe for you, so that he can enjoy a relationship with you, I think I would expect something a little bit more strong than, my belief that a tree is green or something, or that, that this tree is 200 years old or something like that. I'd expect that if there were an argument that came along that were going to sort of push me onto theism, that the recognition that I'd actually become somewhere within me convinced that this was the case would be evidenced by the fact that I'd feel something a bit grander than the kind of experiences that would be attached to more, subtle beliefs.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, different people are obviously, there's going to be lots of factors that go into why a certain argument convinces one person but doesn't end up convincing another person, and that may not just be how sound the argument is, but their psychological kind of response to it and everything else. But ultimately, we know that on the face of it, there are lots of people who are out there who've maybe heard a lot of the arguments, tried to kind of be as open as they can be, as Alex says he has been, Lucas, and say, but, despite all my openness and my searching and my reading of the Gospels, and even maybe I've tried to pray and just, put a, say, God, if you're there, respond, I'm open. They say it still hasn't happened. And on that basis, they say, if God is good, if God, as you say, wants to be in relationship with people, why hasn't it happened to me? Why are there other people like me it hasn't happened to? Is this evidence, therefore, that there's not a God on the other end? And so where do you go with that? Because in simple terms, that's sort of Schellenberger's argument, I think. It's that if there are these non-resistant atheists and non-believers, God, there's no reason he can't see any particularly good reason why God wouldn't be revealing God's self to that person.
Yeah, or not revealing himself yet. I think, and I've mentioned this like previous to our conversation, I think there is a kind of a snapshot frame of reference you can take when talking about this problem of hiddenness, by which I mean, how do I feel about God, or how do I think about God today on this 11th of July in 2022? And it seems to me, someone might say, well, God is hidden. Well, I can't experience him. Again, both the Christian or the non-Christian may actually have that sort of sentiment or feeling. But then another way to look at the whole issue is, well, you look at the period of time, and well, how has God been revealing himself to me, or have I experienced some sort of increased relationship or increased depth of relationship with God? And here is, like, I'd like to get back to kind of to your specific case, Alex, if I'm allowed to call it that. It's I looked at, recently in your conversation with Joe Schmidt, where you put up this tier list for arguments for God's existence. You mentioned, and I was struck. I thought it was quite beautiful or inspiring. You said, the ontological argument is, now I don't know if you meant it sarcastically or anything, but you said it's beautiful, and you used the word, there's something magical about it, which to me suggests something very much along the lines of, well, this actually moves me, that this does something to me. Whereas, and so I went back and checked out what you said a couple of years ago about the ontological argument, and you literally said, I don't think this is even worth the time to bring it up in a debate. And so here's what I like to suggest. And there's other things which you mentioned about other arguments in that video or in that conversation with Joe Schmidt, where I thought, and I went back and checked out other videos, and I felt like, well, there's a very stark contrast. I mean,
this is the problem with YouTube. You can check what you said, 2 or 3 years ago.
So what I'd like to suggest is, in a certain way, when you look at these arguments, or again, the ontological argument, which you now describe as beautiful or magical, couldn't you then somehow say that when you compare where you're at now in relation to where you stood 5 years ago, dare I say, could you say that with regard to this argument, God has kind of come out of the hiding? Because it does seem beautiful to you now, and it does seem magical to you now, which it didn't a couple of years ago. So how, do you know what I mean? It's, well, I can think about God's hiddenness or God's evidence as I feel about it or think about it today, but I can also look at it how I've kind of developed and uncovered or discovered God.
We'll come back to that and hear what Alex has to say after a short break. We'll take breaks here on The Unbelievable Show. And we're talking about divine hiddenness. My guests today, Lucas Ruger and Alex O'Connor. Lucas runs just a moment, so that you won't hear so many cars and trucks going by in the background. But we kind of had a bit of a cliffhanger there, as Lucas asked you, Alex. Essentially, you appear to have changed your mind on some issues. You seem to take some arguments for God more seriously than you used to. And perhaps you could comment on whether you were talking seriously about the ontological argument as a beautiful moves you in some way, whereas a few years ago you were prepared to say it's not worth spending any time on. So yeah, first of all, were you meaning that seriously? And does your move towards taking some of these arguments, more seriously, suggest that God may have been revealing himself to you?
Yes and no.
Okay.
I think the argument is beautiful. I think it's interesting and fascinating and fiercely clever.
What changed your mind, just as a diversion?
Well,
even though Joe was insisting that no philosopher takes this seriously.
Yeah, I know. It's a tragedy. I think, as I said before on my channel, it might have a lot to do with one of my friends who's doing a PhD in the Anselmian ontological argument, and it's probably through discussing it with him, for hours upon hours, that I began to sort of take it a bit more seriously. But I really do think that, and I don't know exactly which video it was you watched, but I made a video just on the ontological argument that was maybe 2017, 2018, something like that. And I actually watched that back recently and nearly privated it because it was so bad. Like it's really bad, and the reason it's so bad is because I didn't understand it. I didn't get the argument, and it's evidenced by, for instance, there's a point where the video I'm responding to says that there's a and I sort of said something like, well, you can't say that actually, because you say that God is necessary, which means he exists in either all possible worlds or no possible worlds. And so when you say this premise that God exists in some possible world, then that can't be the case, because he can't exist in just some possible world. He has to exist in all or none. And this is confusion. I didn't get why the argument was taking this form. Obviously something had gone wrong in my head. And so, of course, at the time, I think that sounds ridiculous, because of course saying if it's possible that God exists, then God exists sounds ridiculous,
Sure.
right? If you don't sort of understand what the argument's driving at. And so, okay, a lot of people have said to me, look, you really need to revisit this. So I do, and I look at it and I think, wow, this is actually quite interesting. This is quite powerful. I wouldn't say that sort of God has come out from hiding here. This is an example of me misunderstanding an argument, and then upon understanding it, thinking that it's very clever. And I don't think my view on how good it is has changed since then. Now, you could still say, well, here's still evidence of an argument that's put forward, which at first you say, that doesn't happen for me, it's ridiculous. And now you're saying it's quite good. But this is kind of the problem all over again. It's like, sure, I didn't understand the argument at first. Like, it's not like that was my fault. At least I don't think it was my fault. I was a teenager and I was trying to look at sort of the logic of possibilities, and I just didn't get it. And so maybe part of the reason why I was an atheist back then was because I'd heard an argument like that and I thought it was ridiculous. Now, maybe that's because of my misunderstanding, but even then, even if that is the case, it's like, what could I have done there? What could I have done differently? So maybe God just has good reason to sort of allow me to be mistaken, so that then in the future I become sort of a theist, and then maybe it's something to do with that journey that actually sort of shows people that, if they're experiencing doubts, that maybe that this is something that happens to people. But then there are all kinds of problems that are raised by that. For example, the problem of believing in libertarian free will as a theist. If you're the kind of theist that thinks that sort of my acceptance of the sacrifice of Jesus is somehow necessary to my salvation, then as long as you believe that there are sort of free human beings who are actually able to do what they like, then sure, maybe God has some grand plan whereby, I'm not a theist, and then 10 years in the future I become a theist, and this has some great sort of practical import. But maybe like 4 years into that, somebody sort of freely chooses to come and murder me. Somebody hits me with their car or something like that. And so I never actually make it that far. There seems to be a bit of a problem here for me, which is that, well, if the reason why I wasn't a theist at the moment my death was because God was doing something himself, like purposefully trying to enact this plan where I eventually become a theist one day. But this gets interrupted because of the existence of free will, and so I end up going to the afterlife not saved. That seems incredibly unfair. Okay, so maybe God sort of knows what I would have done had that not happened. In which case, I kind of ask why it needs to be done at all in the first place. I understand that this could be an argument. It could be like, well, look, yeah, I know that you don't feel God's presence. I know that he's not making himself known to you, but he's doing that on purpose. It seems strange to me to put that in the same argument or in the same position against this problem as saying that but look, there is all of this evidence, there is all of this natural theology that you're sort of ignoring or not understanding or rejecting, but then also saying that actually, no, the reason that you don't feel God is because God has good reason to sort of hide himself from you. These seem to rub up against each other, as well as, of course, that scripture seems to be littered with references to the idea that people should be in you. He could not it because of the existence of free will, and so I end up going to the afterlife not saved. That seems incredibly unfair. Okay, so maybe God sort of knows what I would have done had that not happened, in which case I kind of ask why it needed to be done at all in the first place. I understand that this could be an argument. It could be like, well, look, yeah, I know that you don't feel God's presence, and I know that he's not making himself known to you, but he's doing that on purpose. It seems strange to me to put that in the same argument or in the same position against this problem as saying that, but look, there is all of this evidence, there is all of this natural theology that you're sort of ignoring or not understanding or rejecting. But then also saying that actually, no, the reason that you don't feel God is because God has good reason to sort of hide himself from you. These seem to rub up against each other, as well as, of course, that scripture seems to be littered with references to the idea that people should be able to believe in God. You know, the fool in his heart says there is no God. Romans 1 is a famous example of people saying that this is God saying that essentially the evidence that's been provided to everybody is such that they are without excuse for not having belief in him. I don't mind somebody saying, yeah, that's what Romans 1 means, and it's correct that there is enough evidence for everybody, and you're just somehow missing it or ignoring it or something. Or somebody saying, you know, that there actually isn't enough evidence that's been provided to you, and God has good reason for that. But I don't think you can do both at once.
Okay.
I think you explained that better.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's have a few responses then to some of those thoughts.
There was a lot there. I think just as a comment on the side, I don't know whether it makes sense for us to go in. I mean, I understand where you're coming from by saying, well, if God would allow me to kind of wrestle with all this stuff and all the arguments without coming to believe, and the grand plan is this and that, but maybe it can get messed up. I mean, I guess that's a slightly different question regarding divine providence, and by saying, well, if God would allow me to kind of wrestle with all this stuff and all the arguments without coming to believe, and the grand plan is this and that, but maybe it can't get messed up. I mean, I guess that's a slightly different question regarding divine providence and or how God orders the world and all of that stuff. All I was trying to say is that by looking at your own kind of development or the way you've come, I mean, even emotionally, you yourself said, you know, in your recent debate with Jonathan, that a couple of years ago, you were among those resistant skeptics or non-believers who that said, where he said, well, even if I knew or believed that God existed, or the Christian God at least, I wouldn't want to worship him. Whereas now you are saying of yourself that I'd happily worship him, actually, and I would love to be the recipient of unconditional divine grace. So to me, this seems to suggest that maybe, well, yes, there is certainly a problem of divine hiddenness, and there is certainly this intuitive perception both Christians and non-Christians have that, well, I would like to experience God more, but he just doesn't seem to be out there. Again, I would like to be moved, but I just can't get there. But then maybe there is also the sense of, well, maybe that there is the role you yourself play in hiding from God. You know what I mean? By saying, well, again, back then I didn't want to worship God even if I knew that he existed, whereas now, again, in this sense, I'm saying, well, maybe you yourself have come out of the hiding, if that's kind of a proper use of terms. And again, I understand that you might say, well, what was my fault back then for thinking about God or thinking about worshiping God that way. But and yet again, I would say that well, this gets gets us into a discussion about free will and
Yeah,
all
I
of
mean,
that.
just for the record, in that sense, Alex, when you say you're a non-resistant, I mean, at one time, would you have said, as Lucas seems to be saying, that actually you would have said, no, if God is there, especially the Christian God, I wouldn't want to worship that God, and I would, in a sense, you acknowledged your resistance. You in a different place now, and then the next question, I suppose, is how could you even tell that? Because most of our psychology and motivations aren't often open to us anyway. How would you know that you are genuinely non-resistant and so on? But go
That's
ahead.
true. Of course, no one can have full confidence that they know what they would actually do in a situation so grand as being faced with God. I think it would take a rather brave atheist indeed, or I guess they wouldn't be an atheist anymore, to reject what, if Christianity is true, sort of would be morally justifiable and true on grounds that you somehow have better epistemic access to ethics, which you may indeed have none at all if you have nothing to ground it in. I think it's quite strange. I think, yeah, look, I was quite sort of wrapped up in not just the theism is false, but also theism is terrible and horrible and needs to be eliminated because it's just this disgusting tyrannical force.
Anti-theism.
Yeah, more or less. You end up kind of joining a team, right? And if you start making YouTube videos, as I did, about atheism, and you say this is why I think that there might be no God, and then you find other people doing the same thing, but you find them sort of saying that religion is really bad and very evil. This is just kind of what happens to people if you start listening to a certain form of content. It's quite strange as well, because it's usually a peripheral thing. That's why you find it quite strange that if you know somebody's views on one thing, you can often work out what their views are on something else. If I know your views on abortion, I might be able to work out your views on gun rights. It's like, why is that? Well, maybe it's because there's sort of something on the periphery. And it's not always so direct. It's just because if you're listening to somebody who's super pro-life in America, and you listen to loads and loads of pro-life sources, like, I don't know, something about the algorithm or something about the guests they have on, just
totally,
something just it, and without even noticing, you just start slowly sort of accepting this pro-gun rhetoric. And the same thing happens with theism and atheism, right? If you become an atheist, on the periphery there's this sociological critique of religion, which I was quite swept up in. I'm remain agnostic now on the usefulness of religion. I've said before that I think saying religion is bad is like saying politics is bad. It's like, yeah, but that doesn't really tell us very much. I mean, most Christians would probably think that religion of many forms is quite bad, right? And so it's quite vague. But I certainly wouldn't say that like it would be a bad thing for there to be something like a Christian God who existed.
And so the next question: how do you, how certain are you that you are non-resistant? That if God is there, then you're not putting up any barriers?
Well, I suppose as certain as I can be, to give you a rather boring answer. There's a kind of there's something that needs to be worked out here in terms of how hard a person needs to try. If I did nothing, if I just kind of sat around and said, look, God, come and find me, maybe you'd say, look, you need to do a bit of searching.
Yeah.
But I don't think I could be expected to sort of be on my knees multiple times a day, like begging high heavens to give me a sign, or to dedicate my entire life to studying philosophy and theology, even though, of course, I have actually ended up doing that, which is why I say I think I've actually gone, although I'm not sure exactly sort of how much I should be expected to sort of to do. I think I've gone further than wherever that line may be. But of course, you can do this stuff with the wrong sort of heart, as it were. Like, you can go into studying a degree in theology with the express purpose of trying to undermine it or something like that, which may well have been sort of what was running through my head at the beginning of the degree. I'm not sure. It's actually quite hard to remember, but certainly now I think to myself, look, I live with Christians, and I made that decision purposefully to try to consistently engage them as people who are my friends. So not in like a debate, not where you're trying to one up each other in front of an audience, but where you just sit down and have a conversation with your friends. I read scripture, I go to Bible study groups and this kind of thing.
You do more than many Christians do, frankly.
I try my best. I mean, I still don't do as much as I could. You know, like
Yes.
there are books
enough,
of the Bible that I haven't read. You know,
yeah.
this kind of thing. But I think, look, I can't put my finger on this, but I feel like I'm doing what would be expected.
So as your conscience is clean, that as far as within reason, you're looking, searching. You don't think that you've got a kind of axe to grind against God at this point. And okay, and I think we just have to take that at face value, Lucas, right?
I very much think so. Yes,
Even if you don't believe me, you can just imagine that there's at least one person who does act like that.
No, I do, and I mean in general. I mean, you're not the first person who tells me that. I'm really trying, and I would love for there to be a God, and I try to touch base with Him. And again, I read Scripture, and I go to Bible studies, and I pray, or I listen to worship music, and whatnot. Yes, I do take that at face value. It's not, to. I feel quite awkward saying, well, maybe there's something psychological going on. Other than the only thing that I would have to admit is that, well, even with me, there is psychological stuff going on as a Christian. I too want Christianity to be true. There are underlying reasons why I do certain Christian things, which I'm unaware of. And I thought it was quite interesting in your, you quoted, I think to Jonathan, you quoted Psalm 139, which is about the presence of God. Where can I go from you? And if I make myself, if I go to the ends of the earth, you are there and whatnot. And the psalm ends with the psalmist saying, well, oh God, search my heart, oh God, and know my thoughts.
Yes.
Try me and see if there's any grievous way within me and lead me in the way everlasting. And in between that end and the beginning, which you quote, there's this really messy 3 verses where he talks about, I hate those who hate you. And it's just, you feel like, wow, what's going on here? And then it ends on this note where the psalmist himself, it's as if he becomes aware that he may not be fully in control of what is actually going on. And I think that's why it's so important that Scripture mentions, that Paul mentions in Romans, that we should be renewed in our minds, because again, we seem to be not always quite aware of why we're doing things, and the roots of decision making go very, very deep into depths that we can't grasp. So in this sense, I would definitely say, what you say, Alex. You've tried your best, and yes, I do think you've come to great lengths with all your studies and interactions and whatnot. Yes, I don't think that I don't think it's fair for me to say, well, maybe there is something else going on.
But are you ultimately come to the view, Lucas, that no one can ultimately know? There might still be. It's always possible that there is some kind of resistance within any individual, because we can't know.
I do think, but again, if I was going to say that to Alex, I was only going to say by also adding that, well, I'm in that same boat.
We're all in the same boat.
I'm in that same boat.
I think you might be committed to that view, but it's certainly not something I take personally. It's quite a powerful rhetorical tool, actually. If you're debating somebody and they say, well, look, are you sure you're sort of searching properly? And it's, how dare you, I've done this, I've done that, and you start reeling things off as if it's not possible to do these things, as I say, for the purpose of undermining them. I mean, look, my job is to discuss religion broadly, at least one part of it, and to do it from a critical aspect. So it's like, well, of course you've sort of read Gospels and live with Christians to get an idea of how they think, so that you can better sort of undermine them, this kind of thing. Like, it's possible the person can do that. I don't think that's what I'm doing. I really don't. But I understand why somebody might be committed to the view that that's what I'm doing, at least in some part. It doesn't mean that I'm sort of knowingly sort of deceiving everybody.
What are they even talking about? This is so boring.
Subtle motivation at play. But of course,
you don't need to psychoanalyze people, did I?
There's a sense in which there's also a sort of, Christians often say, everybody wants to sin,
Is this the view, if I could put it this way, that some Christians may say, well, it's not just about changing a belief, it's about changing a lifestyle, and therefore there's going to be a psychological sort of cost and a social cost to becoming a Christian. Therefore, that's bound to weigh on whether an atheist ultimately decides to cross that line.
And it's often implied that to experience the fullness of faith, you need to walk the walk. That is, God will reveal himself once you start living a pious life. We're sort of often told that, like, if you live the life of a Christian, then you might start
Right.
feeling the
If you
fulfillment from
act it out, then it might start to
But this
suddenly
to
become
me
real.
is no surprise. This is just how human psychology works. I'm sure that if I started going to masjid and praying 5 times a day and hanging out with my Muslim friends all of the time and reading Muslim literature all the time, I'd probably become my credence in Islam would probably be increased. Similarly, if I got you to sort of hang out with nobody but vegans for the next month and read nothing but vegan literature and watch factory farm footage,
I mean, just going to lunch with you, I practically came out as a vegan, Alex. So you know,
it's probably going to increase your credence. Right? This is how human psychology works, and so it's no surprise to me that if I were to start living the life of a Christian, I'd probably start finding it a bit more plausible. Fine, but it has to be the other way around here. Of course, there are sins and there are sins, right? There are sins that even just in a sort of colloquial sense. I'm not saying that I'm going to keep going around like murdering people, but I mean there are certain things that are considered sins which can really maybe only be made sense of as sins if you've already accepted the truth of Christianity. It's difficult to put my finger on it. It might include things like lying in certain circumstances, or it might include like casual sex, or things of this sort which people might engage in and not just think, well, I know this is a bit sinful, but I'm not a Christian, but thinking I just don't see anything wrong with this, unless maybe Christianity is true. And even then, I'm not sure quite why it's wrong, but I guess I'd be willing to accept that.
The person that's often quoted on this, because Alex, you're probably familiar with this, is Thomas Nagel. There's a famous passage in one of his books where he says, "The thing is, I don't want it to be true. And I'm troubled by the number of intelligent people I know who do believe in God and Christianity and so on." And that's often used to say, well, look, there's obviously a kind of motivational bias going on very often in this. And Alex, hearing what Alex has to say, does that help at all, Lucas, in the kind of sense of could those kinds of, well, I want to be able to have sex who I want with, and not sort of follow some specific biblical code. Is that going to make a difference in your view to whether people actually are open?
Well, yeah, definitely. I definitely think there are those kinds of people to whom this plays a big role. I mean, Thomas Nagel called this the cosmic authority problem, and he said, I think it's quite pervasive and quite bears quite a bit of the responsibility for the reductionism of our time. That's how he ends.
Being very honest in that sort of moment, wasn't he?
Yeah, then there's all the people who, I mean, his specific reference to sexual morality said that, well, the liberation from the meaning that Christianity is supposed to give was for many of those in our generation a way to have a more sexually liberal lifestyle. So yes, I definitely do think that this is the case with some people. I've had people come and say that, I knew that Christianity is true, or I mean, people from a Muslim background went into New Age and just crazy stories. They felt that God supernaturally revealed himself to them, actually. And so this girl came to me and said, well, Lucas, I knew Christianity to be true way before I actually committed to Christ, but it's because I was aware of the cost that was required in terms of my sexual lifestyle that I didn't want to commit. So I do think, yes, there are those people. But again, as far as I know you, Alex, again, that's why I'm very apprehensive to say, well, maybe there's something going on underneath the surface.
Well,
I don't think that's fair.
I can tell you that there is to a degree, which is, as I say, only in those areas where I might be engaging in things which would be sinful if Christianity were true, but it's difficult to make sense of being wrong if there is no sort of moral authority. Not to imply, so I gave the example of casual sex. I think the casual sex is quite a dangerous thing, it's quite an overrated thing. It's like people don't treat it as seriously as they should. But equally in other contexts, treat it like way more seriously than anything else on planet Earth. It's quite strange that it's sort of everything and nothing at the same time. It's a difficult thing to sort of make sense of, but certainly like, sex before marriage, or if I were homosexual, right, engaging in homosexual sexual activity, or even just homosexual, relationship, it would be the kind of thing where I think to myself, well, look, if Christianity were true and for some reason this was wrong, and I wouldn't understand why. Like, Christianity is such a wonderful, incredible, like just eternity altering thing that sure, I'll happily just give it up. But if somebody's like, yeah, you need to walk the walk and then it will become revealed to you, it's like until I'm pretty much certain that that's the case. It's going to be very difficult for me to justify giving that up.
It's going to be worth the potential benefit.
And that's unlike, if somebody's like sort of engaging in sinful activity that's sort of maybe they're like a drunkard or something, and they think to themselves, well, if there's no God, there's not exactly a reason why this should be like wrong per se, but they sort of feel there's something off about that, right? These kind of things, it's a bit easier to say, well, look, if you start sort of living a bit more piously, then
Oh man, I hope they talk about the argument at some point, bro.
I don't think it's right to say that, well, unless you walk the walk, that God won't reveal himself to you. I mean, there's people who felt God's presence or experienced something even supernatural, even without having walked the walk, whereby, I mean, I would say by sheer grace, God did reveal himself, and they felt something without having done anything, without having committed to anything prior to that experience. And I'd like to, I don't know if this is going to be helpful, but I'd like to kind of throw in Paul Draper's perspective on this. I thought it was very interesting. I don't know what you think about it, Alex. He's, of course, the state-of-the-art example of an agnostic who sits on the fence, who says that, well, the evidence really just points both ways, and I can't make up my mind whether it's naturalism or theism. And yet he goes on to say in one of his essays, he says, well, I think as an agnostic who does sit exactly on the fence, it is, and he uses the term rationally required, for me to engage in religious activity, prayer or scripture reading or what have you. And then he goes on to say that this may actually, and here's an important distinction I think he causes us to make. He says, well, this may actually lead to a relationship with God, even if it doesn't lead to belief in God. And I think, these are some, we were talking about belief and like relationship, or about these things in a technical term. I mean, if belief is, this propositional attitude of holding something to be true or to be the case, he says, well, you can have a relationship with God even if you don't have that propositional attitude of belief. But or what other people say, like acceptance, that is, acting as if something is true, may actually lead to relationship with God. And maybe the kind of the difference between the two is, again, belief is what we mean by that, at least philosophically speaking, is, again, you hold something to be true. Whereas acting as if something is true, that is acceptance, is quite a different ballgame. I mean, you can accept something even if you don't believe in it. Let's say your brother is kidnapped and you feel, you have good evidence that he was also killed, but because of the great good that it would be for him to still live and for you to be reunited with him, you act as if it's true that he's still alive. So you go and search for him, or you do whatever campaign you need to do in order to try and find him. So you act as if it's true that your brother lives, even though you don't actually believe that he lives.
Yeah.
And so Draper is kind of making this case that you can, because for him it is still a real possibility that God does exist. He says, well, I think it's a good thing for me to act as if this is true. And he goes on to say that this may actually, it can lead to a relationship with God, provided that God exists. Of course, if God doesn't exist, if he turns out to not exist, well, there's not going to be any relationship. But I can act as if it's true that he exists. And if he happens to exist, I can develop a relationship.
It's a bit of a Pascal's wager.
It goes a bit into that. And then he goes on to say that, and so this is, I want to say this cautiously to you, Alex, because I know of the great efforts you've done already. He says that, well, maybe for some people, belief may not actually be the primary gateway to a relationship with God, but some people, because again of our different psychological wirings, some of us may actually have to struggle and to wrestle and to be satisfied at first with acting as if it's true that God exists and getting to a relationship with him that way instead of entering through belief already.
And as you said, there are many Christians, I think, who struggle with doubt, who say, my belief in God goes up and down all the time, but I live. But I have to just live this life where actually I believe that whether or not I'm feeling at the moment that God exists, I'm going to trust that God exists, and so on. So belief is sometimes a bit of a difficult thing to say, well, that's what it is, and that's what means God is there or has revealed himself to you. There may be, I guess, on what Lucas is saying, some sense in which you may not even have a belief in God, but still there's a possibility of some kind of relationship with God even in the absence of that belief.
Yeah, but this is what I was talking about a moment ago, which is we have to offer an analysis of what it means to sort of live as if this.
That's actually really interesting. It kind of makes me want to do it, like a deep dive into Pascal's wager. It is actually really interesting because I feel like that is like potentially the reason why a majority of people um 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 why a majority of people do like won't even be open-minded to the idea that God doesn't exist is sort of like a Pascal wager. I think that's almost the reason maybe why almost all of them do not. The ones who do, obviously, there are people who are Christians who do give who are open-minded to that idea but still believe. But like for the people who are closed-minded, I think that like a big reason why almost all of them are like that. I guess that's sort of a challenge too. So like this would be philosophical. And, um, I think that's super interesting. A super interesting idea.
This were true because okay, so I can live as if it were true that I should love my enemies and that I should be compassionate and that sort of love is the basic truth of the universe. Okay, but that doesn't seem adequate to live as if Christianity were true. It would also mean that I would have to stop committing these things which I described earlier as sort of sins if Christianity were true, things which I can only even conceptually begin to understand as in any way wrong if Christianity is already true. And so if we're saying something like, well, look, as an agnostic, maybe a good idea is to do this, because then if it is true, you manage to enter into this relationship even without the belief, then it gets only worse because now you'd be asking me, for instance, if I were gay, to give up homosexual relationships, not even because then I'll be able to finally believe in God, but no, you still won't. You still won't believe any of it's true, but you'll still be sort of living this life as if it's true in the hopes that one day maybe the fact that you've entered into a relationship with a being who isn't sort of willing to demonstrate that he's even in that relationship with you. I guess I feel like that would be a lot to ask of a person. You know what I mean?
I suppose the question isn't whether it's a lot to ask of a person, but whether it in principle could be the case that people who say I haven't had God revealed to me could nevertheless still be in a relationship with God. I suppose it's just asking, are there people, is there a scenario in which actually the belief has to be there?
That's true. But if the kind of resistance involved in making somebody be best described as like a resistant non-believer or somehow sort of not in a relationship with God because of something that they're doing, if that something that they're doing is something like an unwillingness to give up a very important part of their life that they can't see as wrong or sinful until they've already accepted the truth of the proposition, I don't think that's fair. I think that's quite cruel. I'm not exactly sure exactly what the kind of point you're trying to put forward is, but if I try to sort of trace this conversation to something like we were talking about, there are sort of motivations for believing one way or the other, and one of the atheist motivations might be that they just want to sin. And as I said a moment ago, like I do think that's true because everybody wants to to sin. That's the problem of sin. That's for Christians. The whole thing is that everybody wants to sin so much that they unavoidably do. Okay, so I say, well, maybe it's because but then there are certain sins which are only sins really if Christianity is true, and it'd be weird to ask me to sort of give those up. And then maybe, I'll achieve this Christianity thing. And then it seems like Lucas said, well, no, I'm not saying that you need to sort of walk the walk and then God reveals himself to you, but maybe if you sort of do walk the walk, you'll be able to enter into a relationship with him without even knowing it. It's like, is that what you're recommending people like me do? Is that, are you just making that like a conceptual point that it's like possible to enter into a relationship? Because if you're saying that this is what someone in my position should do, then I think you're probably asking too much of me.
We'll have a response, and then we'll have to start to wrap it up, guys.
Yeah. Well, the point I was trying to make with regards to God revealing himself as soon as someone starts to walk the walk, what I'm, maybe that wasn't clear enough or I was being too simplistic. I do think that in certain cases this may be the case, but I reacted against the claim that this is how it works. Because again, I think God interacts with different people in different ways. So it can be that he'll ask of someone, if you want, to walk the walk first, or to act as if Christianity is true before he lets them feel something or like have an experience of him in this sense. Whereas for other people, it will be the case that he lets them feel something or have an experience of the divine before they've done anything really. So this is not for me to know or to judge like what case applies to what person. What I am, and I'm also not saying, and I think this is, because of my theological commitments, I would never say that if you just accept, again, in a technical sense, Christianity, that is, you act as if it's true without believing and you get into a relationship with God, well, this will be enough. I do think, I wouldn't be comfortable holding that position. The scripture does say that in the end it's faith that saves, so there is, and to faith there is certainly a belief component. It's certainly trust in Christ or trust in the truth of Christianity, trust in God, but with that comes a belief component. That is, well, I at least believe, I hold to be true that God exists and that Christ is, was revealed in flesh. So I'm not saying that acceptance, acting as if Christianity is true, is going to be the end of the road. What I'm trying to say is that for some people, and again, that's what I'm saying, I don't want this to sound too harsh on you personally. I do think that for some people this may be the way to go, or this may be the thing, kind of the leap of faith that God is asking someone to take before he lets them experience him, in the sense that, well, even if you're saying, well, there are certain sins that are only considered sins if I accept Christianity to be true, well, maybe, and again, this is very hypothetical, I don't want to kind of under the surface try to point my finger at anything, not at all, but maybe what God is asking a person like you to take the leap of faith and say, well, I actually let go of this, and I truly act as if Christianity is true. I truly kind of take on the Christian proposition that this stuff is not good, and I ought not to do it. You know what I mean? So this is, this may be that kind of the leap of faith, that applies to and also let me just point out that I find it significant that there is this wrestling with God, like a theme of wrestling with God or with the divine that you find in scripture. It's Jacob who wrestles with God, and it's called Israel, one of the meanings of which is, well, the one who struggles and wrestles with God. There is this line you find in scripture, this thread of people not finding God directly through, oh wow, this all makes sense, the evidence is crystal clear to me, yes, sure, I'll be happy to commit, and they may even have had an experience or whatnot. There is this thread of other people not really finding God that way, but just really struggling with it.
We will go to a final break, and we'll conclude our conversation in just a moment. Alex, as we start to conclude this conversation, we talked about the fact that you feel you are genuinely open, as open as you can be. Luke is still saying, but sometimes the journey of faith is not just about God revealing himself to people, but it's about some long struggle with God, and ultimately you only see the big picture in the end, and so on. And who knows, maybe that is just the way it is for some people, and that they're not going to be given this clear evidence that they feel they're owed if there is a God out there. And ultimately it might involve something like, as he says, a kind of trying on of Christianity, a leap of faith that is costly at some level, but for some reason that's part of what God intends for you in the end. So yeah, where do you go with all that?
I don't like to think of divine hiddenness as a response to theism as much as I like to think of theism as a response to divine hiddenness. I think that on an atheist picture of the universe of consciousness essentially arising by accident, we don't sort of know what we're doing here. We develop this faculty of asking why because it's somehow beneficial. And we sort of look at the night sky and we look at the stars and we look at the grandiosity of the whole thing and we say, look, what's going on here? And there's nothing, there's no answer, there's no indication, there's no reason for it. And so, existential dread isn't something that was invented by the existentialists. It's something that probably preceded all religious thought and may have been one of the reasons why it developed. It's not surprising to me, in other words, to find religious scripture littered with people struggling with their inability to find God, and only after a sort of long series of intellectual and practical sacrifice are they able to discover him. Maybe that is what it takes, but maybe that says more about faith than it does about the person. Maybe, it is the case that, okay, speaking poetically, what God asks of me to reveal himself to me is that I essentially throw caution to the wind and just begin to act like a Christian. And that's not true of everybody, that's just true of someone like me, maybe. Now, why might that be the case? Well, maybe because for somebody else, natural theology is enough to make them go, you know what, yeah, that makes sense, and I think I'm going to be a Christian now. Okay, fine. And that person's perfectly content, because now they're happy, they have an explanation, that they have a sort of meaning in their life, sure. And for someone like me, I look at these arguments and I think, yeah, they make sense, but they're just kind of not doing it for me. So somebody says, well, maybe it's because you're resistant. It's like, okay, sure. So then you try to be as non-resistant as possible. You try to engage in sort of Christian literature and debate and argument, even if you're not living like a Christian, but you're being non-resistant at the very least, and then you still feel nothing. And someone comes along and says, okay, well, why don't you just try sort of acting as if it were true, right? You tried sort of being convinced, but you weren't. Now you tried being sort of obsessively open about being convinced and it hasn't worked. Now be so obsessively open that you're just going to actually pretend as if it's true and just act as if it's true. And then maybe, you'll start to see it as true. It's like, well, no surprise. But to me, this seems like a big hope. This seems like looking at the universe, receiving absolutely no answer, not understanding why we're here, and palpably tripping over ourselves to try to make something like this work, to make ourselves feel better about ourselves. And I hate to downplay it so much, but this is unfortunately just the sort of atheistic view of what religion is. It's now that's not to say, now a lot of people say that makes it a bad thing. There's obviously a reason why this has developed. There's obviously a reason why this is sort of universally sprung up among human cultures. Maybe not sort of religion or theism per se, but some sort of feeling of transcendence or numinous. Like, it obviously serves some kind of purpose, right? And of course, that can be perverted into becoming a horrible tool for social injustice or whatever. But in principle, there's obviously something that this does for the human soul. But as I say, I think we've kind of got it the wrong way around. It's not like we have this thing called theism and we're saying here's this thing that lots of people believe, but like, oh well, here's a problem that we hadn't thought of. Why is God not sort of making himself evident to us? I think it's the other way around. We have this kind of emptiness and nihilism and suffering and meaninglessness, which it helps to believe in a God, and that desire is so fundamental, is so sort of deep within a human being, it's sort of almost pre-intellectual, that of course we're going to be able to try all different kind of tricks to make this work for us. And so I also don't think it's surprising. A lot of people say I'm very troubled by the fact that there are lots of very smart people who believe this kind of stuff. For a start, a lot of those smart people are sort of really smart scientists or incredible poets and writers and musicians, and they all believe in God. It's like, okay, you can have incredible intelligence in one area and just be totally unknowledgeable about another, but also incredibly intelligent philosophers. But as I say, even then, I don't think like philosophy is the most appropriate mechanism to God if there is in fact a God. Like, sure, these people are academics and they sort of wear shirts and suits and they show up to debates and they bring their books and all this kind of stuff. But when they get home and take off their clothes and get in the shower, they're still just like a confused ape who wants comfort from the universe that's giving them absolutely no reason explanation as to why they should be getting out of bed in the morning. So it's no surprise to me that all of this development, of course, like the very development of intellectual thought and writing books and having conversations, all of that kind of stuff is itself an outgrowth of something that about doing that's going to help us to survive or make us sort of socially more beneficial. And so if religion is in the same category, it wouldn't surprise me that people are sort of that underneath there somewhere there's something about this longing for some answer that causes them to invent these kind of deities and defend them to the ends of the earth.
Well, we've gone back about 100,000 years there with that conclusion from Alex. Where do you want to begin?
Yeah, I appreciate your thoughts there. I think the question here as well, is it possible to take kind of the scenario you presented or the narrative you presented a step back by saying, I mean, you're essentially saying, so theism is an answer or a response to hiddenness, the hiddenness of meaning or the lack of meaning we seem to see ourselves confronted with. Well, but then the question is also, well, why do we sense that in the first place? Why, if there was no meaning to the universe, why did we even find, this piece of meaning that the universe is meaningless? So I guess the question then becomes, well, what do you take to be ultimate? Or where do you start your narrative? Is it, do you feel, well, we came up with theism and with philosophy and poetry and all of that in response to what you could call divine hiddenness or meaninglessness? Or is the fact that we're actually asking these questions...
That's just interesting. So Lucas is saying, like, well, Alex was saying that there's this hidden feeling, this, like, missing feeling, and we use theism. We try to believe in theism to try and help cope with our, like, empty feeling. And Lucas is saying, like, okay, well, like, let's assume we do have this empty feeling. Why would we use theism to cope? If it doesn't exist, it doesn't seem like it would make sense for theism to be something that we would just believe in.
Questions, not a pointer to the truth that there is actually meaning to be found. Because otherwise, why again would we have come up with why would we have come up with this meaningful view or proposition that there is no meaning in the first place? That's one thing I would say in response. And the other thing I would say is, again, I think, or I want to challenge you not to be too hard, I don't know, not too hard on yourself or on God for that matter, for saying, well, there is no answer, because I do think that you, in some ways, your journey testifies to the fact that you have found certain answers, or at least certain answers have started to maybe click more or to make more sense. And then I guess, and that's maybe a good note to end on, like, I wonder on your behalf, like, okay, how long, O Lord, as the psalmist says in Psalm 13, how long will you hide from me? And that's an answer, I mean, I cannot give. I can certainly see that there is, and again, this may sound super, like, patronizing or, like, harsh to hear it from me, but I can certainly see that there is, with your struggle, and people, I mean, thousands of people kind of testify, like, witnessing it, I mean, there is, like, immense good, I believe, that comes out for people who are forced to think about their lives much more deeply and think about God, for that matter, and Christianity, for that matter, much more deeply. And so I understand that this sounds like, well, you're being sacrificed here on the altar of people finding meaning and a deeper, sense of faith or experience of God. But there may be, I just wonder whether this may be some aspect to the journey.
I mean, maybe you're the next Apostle Paul. It's your wonderful conversion straight after the show, Alex.
Yeah, well, all I'm asking for is something just like a full experience. I tell you, if I experience even just in the form of a flash of light, like St. Paul, although dubious circumstances, I have to say, but even something just like that, just once, just one time. Listen, here I am, and then gone. I could live on that for the rest of my entire life. Just because a lot of people say, well, one reason why God is hiding himself is because if he made himself constantly present in your life, it would be like having a father figure staring over your shoulder. I agree, but I'm not asking for God to hold my hand through this lived experience. I'm asking once, just, and not even for like an overwhelming religious experience with a big waterfall and full of money, but just enough to form a belief that he exists. If I can have just that, just once, then I'll become the most prolific Christian apologist you've ever met.
You heard it here. Lucas and Alex, thank you. It's been a really interesting conversation. And I hope you've enjoyed watching it wherever you're watching from. But we just thought we'd record a bit of a postscript to do this discussion between Lucas and Alex, because we're here in Wycliffe Hall. It's part of Oxford University's Theological College. And the person who kindly helped us to arrange being here in this room is Max Baker-Hitch, who is a tutor both at Wycliffe and for Oxford, the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics. So, Max, thank you very much for organising this and hosting us out.
Yeah, of course.
It's been great to have you. And I think the last time, actually, funny enough, I had Alex in person in the studio. You were opposite him.
That's right.
You may remember. The argument from reason, was it, Alex? We were debating.
Yeah, I think I was woefully unprepared.
I don't think so. I think
it looked good. It was a good looking.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, I did very much enjoy it. I can't believe that's the last time that we feels like so long ago.
Pre-pandemic, that was, yeah, a long time ago. Anyway, you were on the other side of the camera taking some notes, and just wonder what you made of how the argument went.
Yeah, we really enjoyed the discussion. I think the way Alex was framing the divine hiddenness problem was very much in terms of well, what would you expect to see in the world if there were the kind of loving God that Christianity describes? One of the things you might not expect to see, I guess, in the way Alex was framing it, is that there would be people who really are kind of earnestly seeking God and trying their very best to be diligent about looking at the arguments on both sides and kind of opening themselves up, maybe even trying prayer and seemingly not finding God. And so, so I think, you could see this argument as posing a dilemma for theists. On the one hand, you either have to say, well, really everyone deep down is resistant to God, and it's just that we're not very good at introspecting our own psychology and telling what's kind of going on. We deceive ourselves. But really everyone is deep down resisting God. Or you can say, well, no, actually, let's grant that there really are people who are genuinely non-resistant. They really would like to have a relationship with God, and it's not their fault. But God has some good reasons for letting them be in this state. And then you kind of go on to offer what you might see as basically a type of theodicy. And so I think it's fair to say that Alex and Lucas in the discussion focus quite a lot on the first horn of that dilemma.
Yeah, whether we can actually know that we're truly open, rather than granting that some people maybe are, but God may have reasons for not showing himself to them.
Yeah, exactly. And so, and obviously quite a bit of the discussion focused on the case of Alex and his own experience of feeling, sincerely like he is trying to be open to God's existence. I think something Alex was saying about the kind of means by which God would want people to come to relationship in him was really interesting. So I think he put it in terms of, natural theology is really interesting for those who have the time and, the luxury of kind of thinking about these sometimes quite arcane arguments. But surely wouldn't God want people to come to him through religious experience and prayer and so on? And I think, I definitely get that. One thing to throw out there is there's a philosopher called C. Stephen Evans who's tried to make the case that you could see natural theology and religious experience as not being so disconnected from each other. And he suggests that actually at the root of the different kind of major natural theological arguments, cosmological, design, moral, and so on, is actually some kind of primordial experience. So, for example, he talks about this sense of cosmic wonder that he thinks most people probably have at some point in their lives, where they just kind of think, gosh, isn't it weird that there is a universe? Why there doesn't seem to have to be a universe, but there is, and doesn't that cry out for some kind of deeper explanation? And so he does the same for the other arguments as well. And so that's all just by way of saying maybe there is a way to see natural theology and religious experience as more connected.
Yes. There's a kind of intuition there, and which God may be using to reveal himself to people, and even if Alex personally hasn't been moved in, all the way by those kinds of arguments. But yeah, that's interesting. Alex, do you want to respond to that idea that natural theology might be something by which God does directly reveal himself to people?
It's certainly possible.
Yeah,
it's all possible, right? Like, I mean, this is how theodicy, I think, tends to work, is kind of saying, well, look, I mean, it's possible that this is going on. It's like, yeah, I suppose. I think it's certainly true that a lot of natural theology may be some kind of result of cosmic wonder. That is, we try to sort of syllogize what is essentially just a fascinating intuition. Not long ago, I went to see a dramatization of the Gospel of Mark, after which I was with some friends, and most of them Christians, and I met this girl there who I just said something like, "Oh well, look, are you interested in philosophy?" And she said, "Not really. The whole sort of argument thing, like putting it into premises, I can never quite find a way to like put into words what it is that I'm feeling." And I thought, yeah, that makes sense. And as we were talking, I looked over at two of my friends, and they're a bit more into the whole natural theology thing, and they were having this fierce debate, and their faces were scrunched up, and they were sort of tapping the table and saying, I don't know what they were arguing about, but if you take that view, then you've essentially assumed consequentialism, which completely undermines the original premise that we said. And after sort of talking to this guy, I looked over them and I just thought, yeah, surely there's something about it which just felt like that's not. If there's something that it's all about, it's not that,
I get that.
But I feel like there is what I think this almost works in favor of what I was trying to get across, which is something like the idea that natural theology is just a way of human beings trying to sort of make sense of and try to, I guess, legitimize something that is essentially just an intuitive feeling of like, wow, what?
Yeah, I'm very sympathetic to that. I would say I think that cuts both ways though, because I think actually the naturalist philosopher W.V.O. Quine once said that he was basically talking about why he's a naturalist, and he said, I have a preference for desert landscapes. So I think there's something interesting there as well about how actually is our choice of worldview at some level more about just this more holistic, almost aesthetic sense of how it all kind of hangs together in our minds, and actually the arguments that when we try and work out the fine details, those aren't the things that move us. Sure. And so I'm sympathetic to what you're saying, Alex. I just think it can also be true of naturalism.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on what came out in the discussion?
So one other thought I think would be, it was really interesting when Alex was talking about what could take someone from essentially sort of propositional belief in God, or at least some kind of credence that's creeping up above 50%, to relationship with God. And I totally agree that there's a gap there that has to be bridged somehow. And this thing about why an argument does or doesn't move me, and yeah, I when I think about that, actually, in my own case, I there are some natural theological arguments that I think are compelling, and I'm not sure whether I would describe myself as being moved by them. It may be more sometimes than others, but I think that raised for me a question of, is the extent to which an argument moves someone, and where I take that to be more than just credence going up. It's something to do with a kind of emotional desire, or something that propels you into relationship with God. And is that thing that an argument would need to have to do that? Is that an intrinsic property of the argument, or like the fact of the world out there that is the basis of the argument? Or is it something about my psychology? And I'm probably inclined to think it's the latter. And if that's the case, to what extent should I expect God to be kind of tinkering with my psychology to make me react to the cosmological argument in a certain way that I wouldn't otherwise? Because as far as I can see, because there are certainly some people who are really moved by the cosmological argument. You might think that's a bit weird, but I do know people.
I know a young man who said he went into believe it or not, I think it was a history class at A level, and his tutor, who happened to be a Muslim, started for some reason to talk about the cosmological argument, and he said in the course of that half an hour history class, he came out believing in God on the other side, and that was the start of his journey towards Christian faith. So obviously for some people, something lands really strongly, and suddenly something clicks, but obviously, it hasn't been the case of Alex and many other. Well, exactly, but that's the kind of question: why for them and not for others?
And I think there is something here that links in with sort of free will type considerations in relation to the problem of evil, because do we think that it would be fitting in the grand scheme of things for God to be kind of micromanaging people's psychology in such a way that it makes them respond in a certain way to a certain argument? Because the other thing is, for all we know, I mean, our psychologies are so complex and interconnected that if God tinkered with me such that I was, awe-inspired by the Kalam cosmological argument, as it happens, I'm not. But if he did that, it might have all sorts of other knock-on effects. I don't know what those would be that might compromise my freedom in some way. And so I just throw that out there as a question. I think it's something Alex has hit on that's really interesting. Why is it that evidence that in some objective sense might be good evidence, but why does it have this impact on some people and not on others?
Interesting. And any thoughts from you, Lucas, as we start to wind this up?
Like, I found that definitely interesting too. In a certain sense, we're talking about, just generally speaking, leave like atheism or theism or the divine hiddenness argument aside. We're talking about, well, what's the interface between evidence or arguments and human action or human volition, if you will? And what's even more complex is, well, what's the interface between God, human psychology, and the evidence? And it's something I need to think about too. It's what role should God play in kind of tinkering with that interface there? And there's that whole kind of question that I've sometimes wondered about is to what extent is God that interested in just people believing in him? Because faith is not just some kind of rational assent to something. It's obviously more than that. And even if Alex or someone sort of made the intellectual assent, that it doesn't mean that they've done the thing that's actually really important at that point, which is this thing called trust, faith, whatever it is, and so on. And I can imagine people kind of getting to an intellectual place where they believe something, in a kind of intellectual sense, but it still isn't Christianity, it still doesn't move them to that place of actually having a relationship with God. It feels like you've got to say those two things are often different, aren't they?
Yeah, I think so. And I think what Lucas was bringing up about Paul Draper was really interesting, about whether relationship actually requires belief, and there are some people in the divine hiddenness debate.
All right, that debate was pretty boring, honestly, but oh well.
Well, thank you, Alex, for your thoughtful and at times moving opening statement. I appreciate it very much. Now, Alex has raised or essentially two lines of argument against the existence of God, divine hiddenness and the problem of evil. So I'll begin my rebuttal first with a discussion of divine hiddenness. So my view on divine hiddenness is that I trust the goodness of God. I think that there's very powerful.
My name is Alex. I am a graduate of philosophy and theology, and I'm a YouTuber. And that's about all there is to me, right? But I'm ready when you are. If you could let me know when I've got 2 minutes remaining, just by saying 2 minutes, that would be very helpful. Thank you. Thank you, of course, Brian and Jonathan and Sattler College and ladies and gentlemen for coming. This is the second time that I've engaged with Jonathan publicly. I'm glad to pick up where we left off. We didn't quite get to the bottom of God's existence last time. I'm confident we might get there today. I wonder, it'd be quite interesting just to get a feel of the room, actually. How many people here are Christians? Is that the time? Okay, well, it looks like I've got my work cut out for me, but that's my favourite kind of debate, I think. Of course, this is an opening statement, so I won't respond to the arguments you just heard just yet. Instead, I want to make my own case that upon an honest analysis of the world we find ourselves in, it should compel us to dismiss the hypothesis of a supernatural creator. I will not be asking you to look in ancient scripture, nor to the beginning of the universe, nor indeed down a microscope, instead just to your direct experience of the world and facts about the lives of people within it. I will, however, indulge in a brief biblical recital, because I want to begin with a reading from the book of Psalms. So if you could all turn to Psalm 139, unless, of course, you've already committed this famous passage to memory. Verse 7 onwards reads, "Where can I go from your presence? Or where can I flee from your spirit? If I ascend to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths of the Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and settle at the farthest limits of the sea, even there your hand shall guide me, and your right hand shall hold me fast." This poem in its entirety is given by the NRSV a title, "The Inescapable God." It's a message of bold reassurance to the believer, reminding them that since God is present everywhere, pervading every inch of our universe, he is, in the happiest sense possible, inescapable. But my first argument, and it's going to be the first of three, against the viability of theism, flows from the demonstrable fact that this divine consolation is seemingly not offered universally, and often in fact restricted from those who want it the most. I'm going to be making the claim specifically that atheism or naturalism provides a better account for three facts of our universe. The first being the hiddenness of God, the second being the geographical, statistical arrangement, shall we say, of religious belief, and the third will be the problem of gratuitous suffering, and we'll see if we get time to finish it off. Far from being unable to escape God, there is a very real contingent of non-believers, and I would count myself among their number, who are unable by any means to discover him, who seek and do not find, who knock and receive, as it were, no answer. This strange phenomenon is known as the problem of divine hiddenness. If there is a God, then simply, why is he hidden from so many of us so much of the time? If theism is to offer a sufficient account of reality, then it must offer an account of what J.L. Schellenberg has famously labelled non-resistant non-belief, which he distinguishes from resistant non-belief. It's sometimes said by a theist who wishes to explain the problem of divine hiddenness that people simply disbelieve through their own fault. They're too stubborn. They're purposefully blinding themselves to the evidence because they don't want it to be true. They're not approaching the arguments honestly with an open heart, and that if they would only do this, then God would surely reveal himself. Such a person would be what Schellenberg calls a resistant non-believer. He disbelieves, in some sense, because he actively resists it. For what it's worth, I do think that such people exist. I think many such people exist. There are people who come to this debate with their minds already made up. There are people who want it not to be true, that God exists, and in fact wouldn't submit to that truth even if it were true. There was a recent poll run by the Atheist Experience YouTube channel, which I know, Jonathan, you're a fan of, which asked, if there was a God, would you worship it? To which an astonishing 85% of respondents said that they would not. There are, however, also people who disbelieve in God, not out of resistance or stubbornness or a hardened heart, but rather due to sheer lack of conviction. Indeed, many such people actively want to be convinced of God's existence and would jump at the chance of entering into a relationship with him if they thought that he did. But no matter how hard they search, they simply find no answer forthcoming from the heavens, and this is the non-resistant non-believer. Formally, then, Schellenberg's problem of divine hiddenness can be stated as follows. Premise 1, if there is a God, he is perfectly loving, something I'm pretty sure Jonathan agrees with. Premise 2, if a perfectly loving God exists, non-resistant non-belief does not occur. Premise 3, non-resistant non-belief does occur. 4, therefore, no perfectly loving God exists, and the conclusion from the first premise is that therefore there is no God. A loving God, like the Christian God, would surely not refuse any willing person from developing a relationship with him, and so if somebody is truly non-resistant and open to receiving God's grace, we should expect them to receive it. Thus, Schellenberg's assertion that if God exists, then non-resistant non-belief does not exist. The question, then, is there such a thing as non-resistant non-belief, a non-resistant non-believer? To which all I can really say is, nice to meet you. The last time I debated Jonathan a number of years ago, when I was just a few months out of being a teenager, I said that even if I found Christianity to be true, I still wouldn't want to worship the God that it promotes. I now, since then, have realized how irrational and self-defeating this assertion is, and stand before you today as an example of a non-resistant non-believer. I think it would be great if God existed. I really do. I would absolutely love to escape death. I would relish being the recipient of unconditional love. Less selfishly, I would love to be able to worship that which deserves to be worshipped. I just don't think it's true. Now, try as I might, look where I can, I find no response, no hint, nothing. I don't choose to disbelieve in God any more than I choose to disbelieve in aliens, despite how much I might want them to. So when faced with a psalm like Psalm 139, I'm overwhelmed with a sense not of beauty and consolation, but envy and disappointment. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? Where can I go, I should ask in response, to find it? Of course, you cannot know my heart. You can't know if I'm truly as non-resistant as I claim, but I hope that my actions here might betray me. As a Catholic child, I was once an altar boy. I would serve the altar of Mother Church every Sunday dressed in a white robe. In the time since then, I have, to put it mildly, been looking for God. I went to Catholic schools, I studied philosophy and theology at A-levels. I made a career out of engaging with religious arguments. I have explored arguments from contingency, from fine-tuning, from motion, from mathematics, from irreducible complexity and the alleged resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. It may surprise my followers online to learn that at university I visited numerous churches on the invitation of various friends. I spent hours talking with religious friends and
Well, thank you, Alex, for your thoughtful and at times moving opening statement. I appreciate it very much. Now, Alex has raised essentially two lines of argument against the existence of God, divine hiddenness and the problem of evil. So I'll begin my rebuttal first with a discussion of divine hiddenness. So my view on divine hiddenness is that I trust the goodness of God. I think that there's very powerful evidence to think Christianity is true, and so I trust God's goodness as revealed in Scripture, and God, presumably in his omniscience, knows what every person would have done had they had more evidence, i.e. whether they would have chosen to enter into a relationship with God or to reject him. We know from plenty of biblical examples that not everyone who's presented with sufficient evidence for God, whether by miracles, predictive prophecies, direct manifestations, etc., submit to him. If God knows that a given individual is not going to enter into a good, lasting relationship with him, then why would God ensure the person believes? Furthermore, Scripture also indicates that people are judged in accordance with the amount of light that they have rejected. Even many contemporary public atheists have essentially said that no amount of evidence could change their mind. For example, Richard Dawkins was asked in conversation with Peter Boghossian what it would take for him to believe in God, and Dawkins said that not even the second coming would be enough evidence. When Boghossian asked him whether any amount of evidence could change his mind, he replied, "Well, I'm starting to think nothing would," which in a way goes against the grain, because I've always paid lip service to the view that a scientist should change his mind when evidence is forthcoming. It could therefore be seen as an act of mercy for God to withhold from them more evidence if they were going to reject it anyway, and thereby bring upon themselves greater judgment. This adds yet further plausible motivation for God not to ensure that everyone had greater access to evidence for his existence, which would thereby render them more culpable. This point has been independently made by Travis Dumsday in a paper in the Journal of Religious Studies. This last point may be challenged by the skeptic by pointing to the existence of non-resistant non-believers, as Alex, of course, did. Now, he mentioned John Schellenberg, who's the champion advocate of this argument from non-resistant non-believers. And he says, and I'm quoting, "If there exists a God who is always open to a personal relationship with any finite person, then no finite person is ever non-resistantly in a state of non-belief in relation to the proposition that God exists." End quote. But I would question whether there is such a thing as long-term non-resistant non-belief. So my own view is that the evidence for Christianity is such that anyone who is fully informed and takes it upon himself to impartially examine the evidence with a heart open toward accepting God as Lord will, in the long run, come to find Christianity to be true and well supported. In any case, human psychology, particularly at the subconscious level, is so complex that I doubt it's demonstrable that any non-believer is completely non-resistant throughout the course of their lives. A related objection is that it's possible for the evidence for Christianity to have been stronger than it in fact is. Surely, if God existed, he would have given us the strongest possible evidence. But I don't think that we need to expect something that goes beyond perfectly adequate evidence for the serious inquirer. Many atheists are under the mistaken impression that God wants people to believe in him, no matter what they are going to do, go on and do with that knowledge. It's never contended anywhere in Scripture that it's a commendable thing to believe in God yet reject a relationship with him. In the Old Testament, the Jews had no doubt that God existed. They had even seen many miracles performed before their very eyes, and yet they went off time and again into idolatry. Even those who saw Jesus' miracles before.
Yeah. All right. $25. Yeah. 6:30. Yeah, dude. I bet. Okay, bet. Yeah. No, that makes sense. Like, I can respect the Duncan move for sure. All right. Well, then I will see you when you get here, Data.
All right, I'll see you.
Bye.
At the very eyes, didn't believe in him, such as in John 12:37, for instance. And they wanted to put him to death. For example, see the reaction of many after Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. Now, the 18th century lawyer and Christian thinker, Joseph Butler, another hero of mine, in his Analogy of Religion, put forward the...
All right, I think I need to
idea that our time on Earth is a period of probation. For some people in particular, the form that that probation may take is a form of testing whether they are willing to engage.
Oh yeah. All right. So let us let me pee real quick first and foremost. All right, so I guess we will we will do something like I guess let me do my what my argument would be. Well, first we can do Schellenberg's argument, I guess, and try to critique that. So, what's his argument again? God wants and yet he hides. Yeah, I'm honestly thinking that the Schellenberg that the divine hiddenness problem evil arguments. There we go. If there is a God, he's perfectly loving. Well, we can just assume God is perfectly, because we're going to try and internally critique this. So God is perfectly loving. If God is perfectly loving, oh, it's because I'm zoomed in. I was like, why is this like? I guess I can still zoom in and do. If God is perfectly loving, reasonable belief, non-belief does not occur. Is not perfectly loving. So this is the internal critique. I mean, well, you obviously just accept. If God is perfectly loving, reasonable non-belief does not occur. If God is perfectly loving, reasonable non-belief does not occur. I guess this is mostly just what I need to figure out. Alright, if God is loving, reasonable non-belief does not occur. I'll say intentional rejection. Maybe unintentional, I guess. Maybe I should just, instead of creating my own argument, well, I guess I do want to see if, because I don't think think the other arguments work. So like, if God is perfectly loving, I would say like everyone Um, if God wants an intentional, if God wants a relationship with everyone, James is fine. Argument. So let's say God can bring about his goals through any means possible. God's goal is a personal relationship with every human being. Does not have a personal relationship with every human. Conclusion. Not his main goal. God's main goal is a personal relationship with every human. Conclusion, God did not bring about his main goal. One from that would be if God did not bring about his main goal, he is not all powerful. 2. If God is not all powerful, then he does not exist. Conclusion, does not exist. Three, God did not bring about his main goal. If he can, powerful enough. So what would people disagree with? God's main goal is not a personal relationship with every human. What is God's main goal, bruh? Okay, so that's a different argument. Let's say the P1 would be I would say maybe a better way to me to do this would be like if God cannot Let's just see. I don't know. I'm getting too. This argument sound. If P then Q. Oh, okay. I kind of see that. If God exists, if God exists, this is like if P then Q. Okay, well, how did this happen before? I'm replacing the cracker. Oh, okay. If P then R. If R then S, not S, therefore not R, not R, That follows logically. It does follow logically. Okay. I don't need to add on Earth. Okay. Then we can defend each of these. If God exists, then his main goal is personal relationship with every human. What are the potential? Maybe P2 more people would disagree with. If God is all powerful, then he can do anything that is logically.
burgers?
No, thank you. Yes, I'm sure. I have basketball at 7 o'clock. Means like our carpooling again, if that's okay. Did he think that we were leaving for multiple days? Is that why he wanted Zach to leave his car keys?
I think it's just an automatic thing when he hears somebody wants to leave their car, wants them to leave their keys in case he has to move it. I don't know. I was thinking, what if I have to take the boat out and work on it? And
So he obviously, so he knows that we're going to be going for 1.5 hours. Interesting. Mice. There's poop by the trap, though. There's poop around the trap. Come in!